Right now, as you listen to this, somewhere out there in the unimaginable darkness, a galaxy spins. It's home to over 100 billion stars, each one a sun like our own. Around those stars, thousands of planets orbit silently. Some are gas giants, some are frozen wastelands. But a few, a precious few, may have oceans, atmospheres, and perhaps, just perhaps, life. And yet, the universe remains silent, with so many stars, so many worlds, and so much time. Where are the aliens? Where are the civilizations that should have risen and spread, colonizing star systems, sending signals, building wonders we could see from here? Why is the sky so quiet? This is the question that's haunted scientists, philosophers, and dreamers alike. It's known as the Fermi paradox, and it might be the most unsettling mystery in all of science. The story begins, as so many turning stories do, with ordinary light and ordinary laughter. Los Alamos, summer of 1950, scientists at lunch, napkins creased. A cartoon passed around about flying saucers, with that particular mid-century wink. The mood is wry, quick, human. Then Enrico Fermi, who loved jokes and clarity in equal measure, falls quiet. He sets a fork down, or perhaps only his expression, and he asks a question that feels simple enough to write in pencil. But where is everybody? 6 words, and a whole universe of wondering opens like a door on smooth hinges. We have stepped through it ever since. We keep stepping because the room on the other side does not end. The tension we found in that room is now called the Fermi paradox. Not a logical contradiction in the strictest sense, but a soft collision between two kinds of truth. Truth the first, the universe seems lavish, with place hundreds of billions of stars in our own Milky Way, and likely more than 100 billion galaxies beyond that, each a scatter of stellar hearths, planets, once a whisper, now a census. Chemicals we love, water, carbon, nitrogen, turn up like old friends at every party. Time, too, is generous. The galaxy is ancient, a patient spiral slowly writing its name across billions of years. Truth the second, we hear nothing certain, no greetings passed cleanly from the static, no engineered dimming of starlight that insists unmistakably that someone has bent a sun to their will, no unambiguous artifacts drifting between stars, tagged with a return address and a promise to write again. Just the ordinary splendor of physics, the beautiful noise of nature doing what nature does. Between those truths lies a silence that is not empty so much as eloquent. It invites us to lean forward, to ask whether we are the ones too early to the party, or too new to recognize the music, or perhaps huddled in the kitchen while something astonishing happens in the next room. You can feel the shape of that silence if you let your shoulders drop a little and let the mind widen by a few degrees. Imagine yourself under a window's cool pane. The glass holds the last memory of day. The air smells faintly of dust and clean linen. There is a distant hum, refrigerator, streetlight transformer, some companionable machinery that keeps nights modern and gentle. In that everyday hush, you become aware of the distance between should and is. We should, by a certain reckoning, see neighbors everywhere. We do not. The gap is where the paradox hums. We might picture it this way. You walk into a forest you have been told is loud with birds, trills and replies, choruses that overlap like ripples on a lake. The trees are generous, the undergrowth thick with green intent. The evidence of birds is everywhere. Feathers tucked into leaf litter, delicate arcs of droppings on a smooth stone, the perfect negative of a claw in damp bark. And yet, the branches are still, no call, no rustle, wind, yes. Sun, yes. But the one sound you expected most refuses to arrive. How long do you stand there before you begin to wonder, not whether birds exist, but whether this forest is one of the rare groves where they do not sing? Sometimes the forest is quiet because the birds are elsewhere, or because the hour is wrong for song, or because a hawk passed minutes ago and every throat is wisely closed. The shape of the silence matters. Scientists, perhaps more than most, become collectors of silence. We learn to tell them apart. There is the quiet that follows thunder, and the quiet of snow deciding the geometry of a field, and the quiet that means you have built your instrument incorrectly, and will spend the next afternoon in pleasant exasperation. And there is the quiet that holds its ground even after you have checked the cables twice. Fermi's question asks us to hold two clocks in our hands at once. One is the clock of scale, the slowly circling hand that says, with this much time and this many places, even modest likelihoods add up to a crowded sky. The other clock is human and personal. It ticks to the pace of one life and one civilization. It reminds us that our first radios began to spill into space barely more than a century ago, that the bubble of unintended announcements, game shows, news bulletins, weather maps drawn in the language of microwaves, is still scarcely 100 light-years in radius, 100 light-years within a galaxy wide as 100,000, a teardrop in the mouth of the river. Even so, even with that humility, the paradox suggests a pinch. We are unlikely to be the first and only experiment. If anyone began even a small head start ago, say 1,000,000 years, their influence, their whispers, their machinery repurposing sunlight might be visible in principle. Somewhere in this is a lesson about expectations. We are a storytelling species. Our forecasting often borrows the grammar of narrative. We expect crescendos, guest stars, reveals, but the sky may be telling an older story, the kind with long wanderings and slow changes of weather, the kind in which the important events are easy to miss if you insist on trumpets. There is tenderness in noticing that our listening is young. We often talk about telescopes and arrays as if they were extensions of our bodies, and in a way they are, the first true giant ears and eyes our species has taught itself to wear. Learning to listen well takes time. At first, every creak is a ghost. Every glint is a sign. Then the ear matures. It learns the house. It learns which sounds are the woods settling, which are pipes thinking about winter, which are the footfalls of a neighbour's cat on the fence. The paradox has matured with us. The early urge to declare found it, has softened into a patient catalogue of not this, not here, not yet, which is a different kind of progress. At the same time, it would be unkind to pretend the quiet does not stir feelings. Some nights, it is a relief, a wide, dark lake around a campfire of thought. Other nights, it is ache. We have, after all, evolved to thrive in company. We make friends of constellations and personalities out of storms. It would be unsurprising if we also wished for neighbours in the next stellar yard who might, one day, lend a cup of metaphorical sugar. When the mind gets restless with that wish, it helps to widen the frame until the restlessness becomes small again, like a pebble you can carry without effort. You might think of time not as a line but as a field, and of us as an early bloom. Early flowers cannot demand the chorus of summer. They open anyway. If there is a choir coming, we may be the first voice in the hall, finding a pitch. Fermi's lunchtime murmur became a magnet for ideas. Some answers step forward with the calm gait of probability. Perhaps life is rare, because the initial spark chemistry arranging itself into a self-copying knot is rare. Perhaps complex life is rarer still, and general intelligence a curious accident, with poor odds. Perhaps civilizations, when they become capable of reaching outward, tend to fall inward undone by the toys they make before they learn the rituals of careful play. These we will visit in turn. Not to settle them, settlement may be beyond us for now, but to make them comfortable guests, named and understood. Other answers belong to a more mythic register. Perhaps the neighbours are here, and quiet on purpose, tending a preserve. Perhaps they have curated our view like a planetarium, letting us learn the constellations we can handle, before revealing what pulsing structures lie beyond. Perhaps the universe we see is a simulation whose rules include exactly one talking species in this sector, because that keeps the experiment neat. Such ideas might be true, or might only flatter our dramatic sense. Either way, they say something soft about the human habit of wanting to be both observed and left alone. We balance, as science often asks us to, on a ridge between caution and wonder. Caution reminds us that extraordinary claims require audacious evidence, and that the simplest explanations instrument quirks thus behaving in tricky ways. The stubborn strangeness of stars deserve first consideration. Wonder keeps the lamp lit at the window through long winters of negative results. It says, it is worth listening, Even if listening is all we do for a while, there is a small timeline we can hold without strain. In 1950, the question gets its famous phrasing. In the decades that follow, we begin to listen with intent, to comb sky and spectrum for a pattern that is not wind or matter or pulse. We send objects outward with golden hellos engraved on their sides. We learn how often planets occur and how often they sit where water might loiter and think about becoming rivers. We discover that even moons can hide warm oceans under armor. In other words, we keep gathering kindling. Kindling is not yet a fire, but it is what fire eats. If you feel the scale of it tug a bit too hard at your chest, return to a human room. The sheet is cool where your foot has not yet found it. A clock somewhere considers the next second and the next. In such a room, an idea like the Fermi paradox is not a stress, but a lullaby with questions in it. Your mind drifts through images, a metal dish listening to a sky it cannot see, a pencil circling wow on a strip of paper, a lighthouse sweeping a beam that tonight does not find a ship, and still it sweeps, because that is its agreement with the dark. Perhaps the richest thing the paradox offers is not an answer, but a posture. It teaches a way of standing at the threshold between what we believe should exist and what we have so far witnessed. It proposes humility as a tool, patience as an instrument, curiosity as a form of care. It suggests that we can be gentle with the universe and with ourselves while we wait. It implies that silence, properly listened to, is not a rebuke, but a teacher. And there is one more soft gift. The question invites us to know our own planet more intimately. In the absence of other voices, we hear the harmonies here with new attention, the click languages of dolphins in their midnight water, the late summer parliament of crickets, the long vowels of whales trading distances, the busy static of bees mapping a meadow in the currency of pollen. We begin to understand that we are not alone, even if we are, perhaps, singular in a different way. Company abounds, kinship surrounds, intelligence comes in plural. So we begin not with a conclusion but with a careful, awake quiet. We record our expectation that a galaxy so aged and resourceful may be busy in ways we have not yet learned to notice. We record our observation that to the limits of our instruments and our moment in time, we have not found a message meant for us. Between the two we keep a lantern lit, and we name the room for what it is, a room for thinking in the key of night. If you're settling now, let the images fade to their comfortable outlines. Los Alamos laughter, a fork paused over a plate, a question that fits in a pocket, a forest that seems empty until dawn, teaches you a new vocabulary of calls, a planet by a window, listening. The story will widen from here into numbers and guesses and the long arithmetic of possibility. But for tonight's first stretch, it is enough to have felt the hush and to have given it a name. When you're ready, we'll begin to count, not to predict with bravado, but to stack the pieces of our ignorance into a shape we can examine without hurry. The Drake equation waits like a gentle chalkboard at the front of a quiet room. There is room for you in the front row if you like. There is no test, only curiosity, and the soft scratch of symbols becoming questions, becoming a kind of peace. Chalk dust hangs in the air like a tiny fog. A constellation of pale motes between lamp and blackboard. A small room, a few chairs, voices lowered by the wood around them. It is 1961, early autumn at a radio observatory tucked into green hills, and a young astronomer named Frank Drake has drawn a thin line of symbols across the slate. Not an edict, not a prophecy, more like a shopping list for a universe. A careful tally of maybes. He does not promise an answer. He offers a way to hold the question without dropping it. The line on the board becomes a gentle litany. How often do stars like our sun come to be? What fraction of those stars wear planets like jewelry? Of those planets, how many rest in temperate light where water lingers as liquid? Of the temperate worlds, how many manage the leap from chemistry to life? Of living worlds, how many wander into intelligence spacious enough to wonder? Of wandering minds, how many build tools that whisper across space? And for those who whisper, for how long do their messages keep breathing? Multiplying these terms doesn't conjure a precise number, it frames an invitation. We can visit each question the way you might stroll through a garden at dusk, listening to the particular insects at each patch of flowers. You can be methodical and still be soft. If you close your eyes a moment, the board becomes a shoreline. Each factor is a tide pool. We kneel by one, see star birth reflected in its stillness, then move along to the next, where planets swirl as if a child had shaken a snow globe. We begin at the first ripple, the rate at which the Milky Way brings new stars to light. Our galaxy is not in a frenzy, nor is it idle. It hums along, crafting a handful of stars each year from drifting clouds of gas. Some stars small and long-lived, patient red embers, that may burn for 1 trillion years, some briefly brilliant, the blue giants that spend their fuel in youthful extravagance. Around many of them disks of dust flatten and clump, colliding gentler and gentler until worlds are born. The old suspicion that planets might be rare has been retired. The sky keeps handing us new confirmations. A second ripple. What fraction of stars wear those worlds? The answer now seems to be most. We have learned to watch for the faintest wink in starlight, as a planet crosses its face, the tiniest tug in a star's gate, as an orbiting companion pulls, the echo of an unseen world written into the rhythm of light, like a heartbeat in a wrist. Telescopes that stare and do not blink, patient sentinels, have taught us humility. Hot Jupiters hug their suns in tight embraces we did not predict. Super-Earths too heavy for our naming habits are common. They split the difference between rocky and gaseous, in a way our own system did not choose. If you had only the solar system to go by, you might imagine a certain neatness was universal. The galaxy kindly has corrected us. A third ripple, the one that the bedtime story of Goldilocks made famous. The temperate zone. Not too hot, not too cold. But that phrase is a doorway, not a room. Temperature is only the first guest at the table. Habitable for a being like us may also require the protection of a magnetic field, an atmosphere thick enough to cradle, thin enough to breathe, a companion moon to keep a planet's tumble from becoming a feverish wobble, plate tectonics to shuffle continents like a slow card trick, cycling minerals and gases so the air doesn't calcify into a mistake, a star that is steady enough not to crackle with flares so violent that they erase chemistry's slow poetry before it can write a line. And yet, warmth does not always arrive by sunlight alone. Some worlds hide their oceans under ice, keeping them liquid by the braiding of gravity and rock, tidal kneading that warms from within. Imagine for a moment an ocean with no sky, no moon, no stars, only blackness pricked by bioluminescent mathematics and faint mineral tastes, where vents bloom like stone flowers on the seafloor. Life here, if it exists, would not be a child of weather, but of gradients. Hot meeting cold, reduced meeting oxidized, a banquet set by physics for bacteria that know how to dine on difference itself. A reminder, our favorite address is not necessarily the only place the mail gets delivered. The fourth ripple asks, given such homes, how often does life begin? We do not know. On Earth, life started quickly once the planet's surface cooled, also the rocks suggest. Fossils of microbial mats tucked into ancient strata like pressed flowers, traces of carbon that look to cautious eyes like the breath of cells. If life begins readily when conditions are kind, then the universe could be freckled with microbes, like light rain on a pond. If instead, life requires a rare coincidence, an improbable handshake between molecules in a particular puddle at a particular hour, then we may carry an improbable flame. The fifth ripple, intelligence. Here the garden gets twisty. Intelligence is not a ladder, but a landscape. Octopuses solve problems with arms that think, corvids plan, berry deceive with glossy-eyed aplomb. Elephants remember, whales compose, bees dance a calculus of meadow and sun, and yet, only one species, we should say, only one we know, has combined open-ended symbolic language, dexterous hands, cumulative culture, and fire taming into the knack of building radio dishes. Intelligence that flies rockets is not the inevitable crown of evolution. It is a particular braid of traits knotted by history, chance, and environment. On how many worlds would such a braid hold? The sixth ripple, of those who think in symbols, how many build tools that speak beyond their skies? A civilization must gather itself into cities or their equivalents, must learn to store energy, to coordinate across distances, to codify trust into institutions, to solve disagreements without burning everything down too often. It must develop a culture that prizes curiosity enough to spend resources on instruments whose payoff may not come for generations. It must, in short, become patient. And then, the seventh ripple, so often underlined in soft pencil, longevity. How long does the whisper last? This term multiplies the others like a lantern multiplies its own candle power by time. If many civilizations sing, but only briefly, their songs almost never overlap. They become isolated sparks in a night that feels empty between them. If few civilizations sing, but for a very long time, the sky brightens with harmony. In Drake's notation, this becomes L, the average lifetime of a civilization that sends detectable signals. In our language tonight, it becomes the length of a breath we hope is not just an inhale. Numbers would be comforting here, but comfort can mislead. The best we can do is give each term a plausible range, more like the span of a river's meander than the exactness of a ruler, and see what combinations feel natural. Some days we plug in optimistic values and the galaxy hums with neighbors. On other days we set timid ones and find ourselves nearly alone. The truth may not sit at one edge or the other. It may occupy an interior we cannot yet see. To loosen the grip of abstraction, it helps to bring in the slow timeline of our discoveries. In the mid-20th century, planets around other stars were a hypothesis, with very good manners. Then in the 1990s, a wobble in a sun's light betrayed its companion. Our first confirmed exoplanet around a star like ours. The door cracked. The 2000s and 2010s became a parade. Missions that watched for dips in brightness as worlds crossed their suns like moths, slipping across a candle. Surveys that measured stellar sway with such exquisite care that they could tell when a planet's gravity pulled the star into a small, regular dance. Suddenly we had not a handful of planets but thousands. Systems with 7 tightly packed rocky worlds. Systems with giants grazing their stars at impossible proximity. Systems with architectures unlike anything our intuition had prepared us for. Alongside the counting came the character studies. We learned to tug a little information from the way a planet dims starlight at different colors, to infer whether its atmosphere holds water vapor, methane, carbon dioxide breaths that could be planetary, or perhaps someday biological. We found to our delighted caution worlds in temperate zones that are rocky and roughly Earth-sized, circling small, long-lived red stars. The caveat arrived attached. Many such stars are feisty in youth, flaring off. Life, if it starts there, must either be sturdy in the face of tantrums or blessed with a good umbrella. The phrase habitable zone hardened in the public imagination, as phrases do, into something like a halo. But habitability is not a ring painted on a map. It's a conversation between a world, its star, its geology, its chemistry, and time. A planet can be in a star's temperate band and still be locked in ice if it cannot hold heat, or boiled dry if greenhouse gases tipped past a delicate threshold. Another planet can sit just outside the canonical zone and still enjoy lakes and rains if internal heat or atmospheric cleverness compensates. We could rename the region the maybe zone, and our predictions would be humbler, but perhaps also kinder. As our catalogue of worlds grows, so does our imagination for niches. Tidal locking, where a planet shows the same face to its star, day on one side forever, night on the other. Once seemed a sentence to extremes. Now climate models propose a temperate twilight band between furnace and freezer, where winds might carry weather in loops that could sustain seas. Snowball planets might host subglacial oceans, insulated and ancient. Desert worlds might gather their water at poles or in deep basins where shadow keeps it cool. The more we look, the more we understand that life's playground is not 5 slides and a swing, it is a forest with many rooms. Drake's last term, longevity, haunts the rest, not as a spectre, but as a reminder that time is the medium in which possibility dissolves or crystallizes. Think of 2 lanterns set far apart on a ridge. There is also the matter of neighborhood. Some regions of the galaxy may be kind, others less so. Near the center, stars crowd and radiation hisses, and supernovae arrive like thunder too close to the house. Far in the outskirts, the elements that build rocks and bones are scarcer, and star formation slows to a contemplative pace. In between, a broad band where conditions might be comfy, though even here, comfort is not guaranteed. This galactic habitable zone, if it exists in a strong sense, is more like a climate than a border. The concept itself is debated, which is healthy. It keeps us from making the map too crisp. When the terrain is still in fog, we return, again and again, to the habit of counting with humility. The Drake equation, drawn carefully, isn't a scoreboard, it's a mindfulness bell. Each term rings a separate awareness. Stars are plentiful, planets are not rare, temperate conditions can be defined, and then doubted, and then refined. Life might start with ease, or with extraordinary luck. Intelligence is many things, not all of them technological. Technology that speaks is contingent on culture and on a species' willingness to look up. Longevity is an art, not a given. As you listen, perhaps you notice a slow relaxation, like lace settling on a table. The urge to demand a number loose. We can dwell, instead, on the image we used before, a valley of villages. Some lanterns new, some embers old, many windows dark because the houses are not yet built, or because their inhabitants learned to sleep under stars without lamps. The Drake equation becomes a way to estimate how many windows might, in principle, be lit at once. It does not tell us whether we can see them from our hill. There is another, quieter function to this counting. It teaches gratitude. The more conditions we add to habitable, the more miraculous our address begins to feel. Not because it is uniquely precious in the entire cosmos, but because it is precious to us, and improbabilities, when stacked, deserve a kind of reverence. Our magnetic field, our patient star, our temperate distance, our plate tectonics, our large moon, our fortuitous asteroid history. They are the supporting cast that lets life in this particular costume stand on this particular stage and speak in this particular voice. Counting them need not diminish our hopes for others. It can deepen our care for home. At the edge of this chapter's walk, let's return to the little chalkboard in the woods. It's evening now. The windows are dark glass with a faint reflection of the room inside. Drake lowers the chalk. Others talk, gesture, propose values. The symbols, arth, if, ne, efle, fi, fc, l, are less important than the mood, a mixture of almost childlike delight and an adult's respect for uncertainty. We have kept that mood alive for decades. We have built listening posts and sent faint cards into the night. If you're settling deeper into the pillow now, let your mind float over a simple image to take with you toward drowsiness. A row of jars on a shelf, each labeled with one of the equation's questions. In some, we've poured something clear and definite. In others, we've placed a slip of paper with a range of guesses. In one or two, the jar is still empty, waiting. There is no shame in waiting. The patient shelf is a kind of wisdom. Soon we will speak about time in a more urgent key. How quickly a civilization, if it chooses, might spread through a galaxy. Why a head start of 1,000,000 years matters in a place 14 billion years old. How a wave of exploration could in principle be visible everywhere, and why its absence worries us. But before we turn to that swifter tide, it feels right to pause here, in a room of questions lined up like constellations. Count the possible, and you become gentler with the impossible. Count the steps, and you respect the stumble. Count the maybes, and you learn to live graciously with the word yet. There is a rhythm to darkness, a pace that feels slow from the inside, yet measured against the history of stars, turns swift, like the way dusk crawls across a field, and then all at once you can no longer see the fence. Tonight we hold that rhythm in our hands, and ask a question that seems simple enough to whisper. If minds like ours learn to travel, how long would it really take for them to cross a galaxy? You might picture the Milky Way as a great luminous wheel, 100,000 light-years from rim to rim, thick with stars and drifting lanes of dust. We live not at the center but in a quieter suburb, far from the downtown blaze, near a spiral arm where the traffic thins. Our sun circles slowly, a 200 million year loop through a city of fire. Now imagine, very gently, that some distant species, curious, patient, decides to wander. They do not need to outrun light. They only need to keep moving. A ship that coasts at a small fraction of light speed, pausing every few decades or centuries to replenish, would stitch the nearby stars together the way hikers stitch valleys, one ridge, then the next. Never the whole mountain range at once, just the next right step. If we close our eyes, the math becomes a lullaby. The nearest sun beyond ours is a little over 4 light-years away. At 10% the speed of light, a velocity that is still unimaginable to our current ships, but conceivable as physics. Such a crossing might take a few decades, at 1%, a few centuries. Add time to brake, to explore, to rest the hull and the minds aboard, and the journey becomes a human-scaled saga. But sagas stack. A civilization that settles a new system can build 2 ships, instead of 1, 4 instead of 2, and a wave begins. Waves do not need heroics, they need persistence. A slowly expanding bubble of presence, system to system, could some models suggest touch most of the Milky Way in a few million to tens of millions of years. A long time to us, but a finger-tap in galactic history. Breathe in and consider the galaxy has had thousands of such finger-taps to spend. Some prefer a different traveler, a machine that carries curiosity without sleep, a probe that mines ice for fuel, harvests sunlight with patient wings, and crucially, knows how to make copies of itself when it finds the raw materials. Such self-replicating scouts, sent outward in a thin shell, could, at least in theory, fill the stellar neighborhood with watchful seeds. They could be slow, careful, and thorough. They could tuck themselves into cometary halos, nap for long winters, and wake when a system changes. If anyone had launched them millions of years ago, we might expect by now to see their footprints across many shores. We do not. Or rather, we do not recognize them. The night retains its ordinary signature. Here the Fermi paradox bites softly again. If travel and settlement are possible at even modest speeds, if time is generous, and if curiosity is a near-universal trait of minds that survive, why doesn't the sky rustle with evidence of travelers? Why don't we see the glints of mirrored sails, the careful geometry of beamed power, the telltale waste heat of stellar industries? Why is the night's speed, its slow march across unlit meadows, still the only motion we can swear to? Before we rush to answer, it helps to look closely at the assumptions. Travel is not merely a question of engines, it is a question of choices. Many paths that are possible are not chosen. Forests spread until they meet a climate they prefer, then they deepen rather than widen. Coral reefs expand and also complicate themselves in place, building baroque cities upwards instead of marching across the whole sea. A civilization might discover a gentle enough satisfaction in local abundance that the urge to spray itself across the galaxy quiets. Expansion, after all, carries costs. Ecological, cultural, ethical. An old and wise culture could decide to grow inward, more depth, more art, more subtlety, rather than outward. They might look at the long arithmetic of risk and decide that surviving beautifully in one garden beats surviving thinly in many deserts. It is also possible that the galaxy's geography is trickier than our maps make it seem. Stars are not scattered evenly. They move, they flare, they die flamboyantly. Regions close to the center hum with radiation and turbulent gravity. Regions in the outskirts are metal poor, the raw ingredients of rocky worlds in short supply. Between these extremes, clouds of gas and dust braid and unbraid, sculpted by supernovae and the patient wind of starlight. A wave of exploration could find channels, safe corridors through stellar weather, and avoid others. The result would be less like paint spreading in a tidy circle, and more like ivy finding a path along a wall, thick here, sparse there, whole patches bare for ages. We should also admit that travel might rarely be permanent. Settlements can fail, ships can choose to turn back. Outposts, if they keep a culture's name, but not its appetite for voyages, could become quiet monasteries of knowledge, steeped in their local skies, disinclined to shout. Their descendants may care for their star with such intimacy that the idea of leaving feels like leaving a parent to grow old alone. This is not failure, it is a different success. And yet, the paradox lingers. because even a few ambitious lineages across aeons ought to have left signatures too loud to miss. This leads to a different kind of explanation, one that asks less about choice and more about limits. Energy leaves traces. The civilization that builds vast machines must pay the tax of waste heat. The more you do, the more you must vent. If a people swarmed their star with collectors, mirrors and panels sipping photons, the light we see from that star would change. Some of the bright visible glow would be converted to darker warmth. Infrared surveys should find such stars burning wrong for their age and type. We have looked. We have found. So far, very few candidates that survive scrutiny. Most oddballs return to ordinary when dust or disks or stellar tantrums are accounted for. But efficiency muddies this expectation. The better one becomes at using energy, the less waste one leaks. A culture that learns to do more with less might fade toward thermodynamic modesty, still powerful locally, but a careful housekeeper. If they move computation into cold places far from stars, out where heat can be bled into deep space with less effort, their glow dims. If they prefer low-power architectures, slow thinking that lives on geologic time, their signatures could look like nature's own. Perhaps our searchers have been tuned to fireworks while the elders of the galaxy knit by candle. There is also the possibility that very advanced activities happen at scales we aren't yet watching. Imagine engineering not a star's light, but its motion, a patient tug, using giant sails that catch starlight to gently reshuffle the choreography of a system over millions of years. The brightness barely changes. The long intentions are written instead into orbital drift, or imagine moving computation into substrates we do not associate with life at all. Dust clouds, magnetic fields, the low whispers of plasma, places where only a pattern, not a machine, is the real actor. Our eyes could slide over such architectures the way a passerby overlooks a cathedral carved in the negative, the space between stones more important than the stones themselves. At this point, a different symbol often enters the room, wearing the slightly theatrical cloak of a scale. Kardashev's ladder, type 1, 2, 3, was proposed as a way to talk about civilizations by their appetite for energy, planetary, then stellar, then galactic. It's useful in moderation. It reminds us that scale changes behavior, but it may also be a map drawn by a particular kind of ambition. A garden can be thriving without becoming a continent. A poem does not become more meaningful by shouting. Still, even if many choose gardens over empires, the galaxy's age argues that a handful would have tried the grand project. The absence of obvious grand projects is informative. Perhaps it means such projects tend to self-destruct, a cautionary echo we should study. Perhaps it means they are less visually flamboyant than we assumed, more like dark art than neon. Or perhaps it means the projects are there, but not in the band of time or space we have scanned. Our surveys are wide, but not yet deep, deep, but not yet everywhere. Consider, too, the ethics of contact. A civilization that spreads may learn that every young sky it meets is full of buds, cultures, biomes, ecologies, each with its own cadence of becoming. To step in loudly is to bruise. To speak in a new tongue is to shape what that tongue can later say. An old traveler might develop something like a vow of non-interference, or a form of consent-seeking that takes centuries. From our perspective, that would look like silence ringed by invisible care watchers who wait until we can see them as equals and invite them in, rather than visitors who impose themselves. The speed of night would therefore be deliberate slowness, a moral choice stretching across light years. For a moment, let's ground all of this in a human body. Imagine you're lying flat, spine long, the weight of blankets a gentle gravity. Think of the spaces between your breaths as little interstellar gulfs. You cross them without rush. Inhale, a star. Exhale, the dark between. Over time, without drama, you traverse a great distance. The speed of your night is not how fast you move, but how consistently you continue. Civilizations, too, might rely less on sprinting and more on staying. Some nights the thought of self-replicating probes returns like a moth to the lamp. They are efficient, a little scary, and oddly elegant. If such devices are easy to build for those a few centuries ahead of us, Why don't we see the crumbs they leave behind? One answer: perhaps most species teach themselves, or are taught by experience, to limit replication. Growth without governance becomes a paper mold, a bloom that consumes the book it lives on. Wisdom in this telling is restraint, an evolved etiquette among advanced actors that says, do not fill every niche. Leave ecosystems room. Machines that copy only when invited, only to a sustainable density, would not flood the sky with obvious artifacts. They would be polite guests. Another answer: perhaps probes had been here long ago or last week, and we did not know what to call them. A device the size of a meteor, cold and quiet, drifting in a halo of cometary ice, could monitor our radio weather and never once shine directly at the ground. A structure parked on the far side of the moon, perfectly black in radio and optical bands we favor, would be another shadow amid shadows. In a solar system full of rocks and reflections, not recognized is not the same as not present. This isn't to suggest a secret fleet, it's to suggest humility about what counts as visible. Some caution that even modest travel is harder than the bedtime math implies. Time erodes intentions, generations shift priorities, languages drift. An empire of settlement might fall into islands of memory and myth. A chain of way stations could forget why the chain was forged. A culture that once launched ships because it feared a dying sun could find, generations later, that the sun is steady and the fear is gone. What began as necessity becomes an option. Options are often deferred. The wave decays. The frontier becomes a garden, a library, a place where people take long walks at dusk and put telescopes on rooftops and listen. And yet, the drift of all these possibilities doesn't fully let the paradox off the hook. You, me, and 1,000 careful thinkers can each compose a tender, plausible reason why a particular civilization might choose quiet over conquest, gardens over glare. But the galaxy has had immense time. Even if 99 of 100 old cultures become inward, the 100th could be an engineer with bright ideas and a long memory. The absence of that 100th footprint suggests either that such engineers rarely survive, or that their surviving projects are, by design, very hard to see. This is where the notion of the percolation of settlement enters. Less a flood, more a spreading foam. In some versions of the idea, colonization doesn't fill all space. It reaches pockets, and then stalls at natural barriers, gaps between star groups, deserts of low density, zones of hazard. The galaxy seen through this lens becomes a patchwork of explored and unexplored regions. We might be in a quiet patch, not because everyone is quiet, but because the routes to us are thin and the ferry runs rarely. If so, the silence is like winter in a mountain town. It does not mean the world is empty. It means the passes are closed for now. There is comfort in remembering that these are models, not pronouncements. They help us feel the size of possibility without pretending to pin it down. They also help us design our own behavior. If the speed of night, the pace at which civilization spreads, or chooses not to, is slow and deliberate, then our best contribution may be to last, to remain a steady lantern in our corner of the valley, to make our light inviting, non-invasive, generous. A last image before we dim the lamp for this chapter. Imagine the Milky Way from far above, a pinwheel of pale starlight on black velvet. Now slowly bring your attention inward, until you are once again a person in a small room listening to a large idea. The arc from galaxy to pillow is long and gentle. You have just travelled it. The question of speed has softened. We see that time in this context is not a whip, but a fabric. Pull too hard and it tears. Learn its weave and you can stitch. Maybe the most faithful conclusion we can hold for now is this. Crossing a galaxy is not magic. It is patience compounded. If we live long enough and learn how to thread our ships and our ethics through the currents, we might join the slow dance. If others already have, their footsteps either missed our stage or were quiet by intention. The night moves at a speed older than our urgency. We can match it by being durable rather than loud. In the next stretch, we'll turn our ear outward again and talk about signs, what a voice from far away might sound like, how structures could betray their makers, and why even silence, carefully passed, has accents. But for now, let the notion of patient travel settle into your breathing. One star, then the next. One life, then another. A wave that does not crash, only continues. There is a particular kind of night that belongs to observatories, a hush kin to libraries and sleeping harbours. Console lights glow like embers. Fans murmur in even breaths. Coffee cools on a coaster beside a notebook, whose pages are already quietly freckled with numbers. You could mistake the scene for any midnight office, except that the window at the far end of the room isn't a window at all. It's a spectrum unrolling, a waterfall of faint lines and colours that come not from a street lamp or a passing car, but from everywhere, from the sky itself talking in static. Someone adjusts a dial. A thin whistle slides, vanishes, returns. The world outside is cradled in wind and ordinary darkness. The world on the screens is flooded with an invisible day, radio day, laser day, the day of microwaves and millimeter waves, and the slow warmth of dust. It is in rooms like this that humanity listens, earnest and small, and genuinely hopeful, for a sound that might not be ours. When we say, we've heard nothing, we don't mean that space is quiet. Space is exuberant. Pulsars tick like regal metronomes. Hydrogen clouds hum at their characteristic pitch. Magnards throw tantrums. Quasars seethe. The sun itself crackles with business. The radio sky is busy to the point of generosity. And precisely because of that, because the night roars softly with natural instruments, we can hope that the deliberate, unnatural tones of technology might stand out the way a flute stands out in a rainstorm. So our first task is simple and difficult at once. Learn the voice of nature well enough to recognize when a syllable isn't hers. The modern chapter of that listening begins in an almost homespun key. In 1960, a small radio telescope in West Virginia embarked on a project with a name that felt like a wink. Project Ozma. The instrument was not grand by today's standards. The idea was aim at nearby, sun-like stars and listen at a promising frequency. The whisper of neutral hydrogen, the most common element in the universe. Hydrogen speaks at about 1420 megahertz, and that neighborhood on the dial feels sensible in a cosmic way. A waterhole between the shouts of hydrogen and hydroxyl, a place where someone might reasonably choose to meet, because the physics itself had posted a sign. The search was brief. It didn't catch a greeting. Still, a quiet precedent had been set. Point, listen, be patient, try again. Across decades, point and listen grew softer in ego and richer in method. We watched not only at the hydrogen line, but across wide bands. We traded single dishes for arrays, fields of smaller ears that in combination become very sharp listeners. We interleaved dedicated surveys with opportunistic ones, borrowing time when telescopes were free, sifting their data for patterns that had nothing to do with the original reason for pointing. SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, learned to be both a discipline and a habit, like keeping a weather eye even on calm seas. We also, shyly and with a kind of hope that feels like writing your name in the sand, tried speaking. The Arecibo message of 1974, deliberately beamed, was a puzzle sent toward a globular cluster. A grainy picture and binary meant not to be understood immediately, but to be decodable in principle. Later postcards followed from other transmitters, a handful of intentional pings and hello out there notes. More symbolic than likely to be received, all of them less a shout than a wave across an unthinkable field. And amid all this, in 1977, a radio telescope with a friendly nickname Big Ear caught something brief and bright enough to make a person write an exclamation in red pen in the margin. Wow, 72 seconds of signal in a narrow band where you would not expect terrestrial interference, strong enough to raise eyebrows, never seen again. We have explained and unexplained it in cycles ever since. A comet, a satellite glint, a quirk of the instrument, a coincidence, a tease. It could be any of these. The point is not the answer. The point is that the universe sometimes hands us one firefly and then closes the jar. The wow signal remains a good story told in a careful voice, an amber in which curiosity is preserved without embellishment. Listening widened beyond radio. There is an optical SETI too. Lasers, if used for interstellar communication or navigation, could etch hair-thin flashes into starlight narrow, periodic, brighter in a moment than a star itself, and then gone. We built photometers that can notice such pinpricks, devised algorithms that distinguish between the stutter of atmosphere and the crisp handclap of a coherent beam. We've watched for pulses and for steady lines where they shouldn't be, like a river flowing uphill. We learned to look for technosignatures in general, a gentle umbrella term for any sign that technology ours or another's has altered a natural scene. Some of these signatures would be loud and obvious if they existed. A star dimming in geometric steps as structures orbit it. A galaxy that shines too brightly in the infrared because so many of its stars are wrapped in effect in blankets that capture light and re-radiate heat. Others would be quiet. A particular cocktail of gases in a planet's atmosphere that shouldn't coexist unless someone were making them on purpose. Nightside illumination on an exoplanet, faint but regular, a grid of light where geology alone would be dark. The hope has a straightforward logic. Energy cannot be used without consequence. It goes somewhere, usually as heat. Organization cannot happen without leaving fingerprints. Even careful hands leave oil on a page. If an older civilization has made large, enduring choices, put mirrors in space, frozen comets into useful shadows, tuned a planet's weather with great patience, it might have painted a subtle pattern we could, with enough attention, recognize as artifice. This is where Dyson's swarms enter like a wide, speculative smile. Not domes around stars, an old, dramatic idea popular in fiction, but swarms, a trillion small collectors orbiting in choreographed freedom, sipping photons, living like a haze of industrious bees. No one knows whether anyone would build such a thing. The engineering is breathtaking, but in principle the waste heat of such a swarm would be a signature. The star would dim in visible light, glow more warmly in infrared. You would expect to find needles of wrongness in a haystack of normal stars. We have looked for those needles. Surveys tuned to infrared light have raked whole catalogues of galaxies and many patches of the Milky Way, asking gently, who looks too warm for their age? A few candidates stepped forward, most resolved into ordinary dust or misunderstood data when seen with clearer eyes. One famous star, quirky in its dimming over months and years, was for a while an irresistible canvas for fevered engineering. The romance faded when evidence pointed toward dust, perhaps exhaled by comets, or by the star itself in some elaborate natural drama. The romance fading was not a failure, it was a success of method, the joy of possibility followed by the relief of explanation. We've also sketched more exotic technosignatures, artificial rings whose transits across a star would make light curves with straight edges, planets with engineered albedo, reflectivity too clean for geology to sustain, artifacts parked in stable gravitational niches, Lagrange points where they could loiter without spending much fuel. We've dreamed with caution of noticing pollutants we ourselves invented, chlorofluorocarbons, say, or nitrogen oxides hanging in the air of a far world. These would be paradoxical scents, a little alarming, a little endearing, implying both industry and a willingness to leave footprints. Then there is the category of signs that are not beacons but byproducts. If someone out there loves particle accelerators the way we love them, do they run experiments so ambitious that they leave faint scars on the fabric of space we might notice? If computation is their devotion, do they favor cold, dark habitats, way out in the deep, where heat sinks are easy, so that the heart of their civilization becomes deliberately dim? If they have been caretakers rather than empire builders, might their largest projects resemble gardening, moving comets like sheep, reshaping orbits with sails so vast and thin that they are more ghost than cloth? In each case, the reasonable expectation is that physics keeps receipts. Heat, light, motion, these betray intention when scaled. And yet, as our instruments have sharpened, we have not found receipts. We can read with confidence and say, yes, this was written by hands. The night continues to look like a masterpiece painted by nature alone. This could be discouraging. It could also be a cue to adjust our hearing. Marine biologists know this feel. They put hydrophones into the water and listen for whales. A season passes with no songs. Then a day arrives when the ocean seems suddenly crisscrossed with voices. The whales did not appear from nowhere. They were simply silent, or distant, or singing at frequencies and hours the instruments had not matched. Negative results, carefully kept, are not empty. They shape the next expedition. So, in radio rooms and optical domes, we keep collecting, no, not this. We learn the accents of satellites, the harmonics of power lines, the little squeaks of our own devices misbehaving. We share databases so that what fooled one group does not fool another in the same way. We let software grow alongside ears, algorithms that can spot patterns too faint or too brief for tired eyes. We invite students and citizen scientists to scan light curves, not because many eyes make miracles, but because many eyes make honest work joyful. There is a chronology to this patience. After the early Romantic years, Project Ozma, catching a few hours of starlight on a handful of nights, the field became steadier. Government support arrived, then left, then arrived again in different clothing. Private patrons with a taste for the long-view funded arrays that could spend years on the same patch of sky. International collaborations formed, because the sky itself does not answer to borders, and because any signal of consequence would be better confirmed by telescopes that do not share a power grid or a climate. We also began to think about etiquette. If we could send messages, should we? Messaging extraterrestrial intelligence. METI sits beside SETI like the outgoing mailbox beside the incoming one. Some argue that silence is safer than letters in a dark forest. Others argue that hiding is both impossible and ungracious. Our planet has been noisy for a century and photogenic for far longer. The debate is not an argument about fear so much as an argument about time. How do you behave responsibly when the response time to a letter might be centuries and the recipients are unknown? For now, the prevailing mood is cautious, curious, kind. We send a little, mostly, we listen. Listening has grown to include ideas that would have sounded fanciful to earlier generations, but now feel like due diligence. Could we detect the glow of city lights on the night side of an exoplanet as it passes across its star? Perhaps, if the lights were very many and our telescopes very fine, could we watch a planet's seasons and notice a terraforming signature green that appears too quickly, snow that falls in a pattern too regular to be weather alone? Perhaps, if the planet were obliging and the gardener patient, could we catch in the flicker of a star the shadow of a megastructure that uses geometry as a language? If someone wished to be found, a triangle or a set of ratios hiding in the cadence of dips would be a sweet kind of poetry. We have not seen such geometry. We have, however, learned to love the oddities we do see for what they really are. Dust around young stars trying on planets like hats, elderly stars burping in ways that make slopes and steps in their light, disks that flutter because planets within them are learning to share. We have learned to look at an anomaly and say, first, what does nature do when she is bored? And only later, if nature has no ready answer, to whisper, perhaps. This order matters. It keeps wonder from curdling into credulity. It respects the sky. In a very human sense, the long silence has changed us. In good ways. It has made the field more generous with its data. It has invited architects and philosophers to lunch with astronomers and electrical engineers. It has taught us to speak plainly to one another about thresholds and false positives and the humble inevitability of disappointment. It has taught us to savor, not just endure, the rhythm of maybe no, maybe no, maybe oh, even when O turns out to be a well-behaved star wearing a veil of dust. And then there is the simple truth that the search itself is worth something independent of its outcome. To scan the sky this intently is to become better at astronomy in general. Technosignature surveys find comets, discover variable stars, refine maps of hydrogen that future missions will use. A program meant to hear a neighbor may, in the meantime, learn the dialects of the neighborhood's weather. The work is suited to nights and to long patience, and there is a quiet virtue in that. It trains a muscle we will need for other long projects. Climate care, reef repair, the slow unwinding of injustice. Listening is practice for stewardship. If you'd like, take a breath with the instruments. Imagine the waterfall display as a river color tumbling downward, time falling like water. Your breath moves with it. In, out. Somewhere in that river are the known currents, hydrogen's line, Earth's own transmissions wrapping around to bite their tails, and somewhere perhaps a current we have not named. You don't need to find it tonight. You only need to remember that rivers carve canyons with persistence, and that we too can be patient stone. At the other end of the room, a technician writes a timestamp, tucks a loose paper under a mug, and steps out to feel the outside weather. The telescope continues to listen. The sky continues to say exactly what the sky has always said, and our receivers continue to ask, with increasing courtesy, could you say that again? Just a little differently, if you mean to speak to us. And that is where Structures returns for a last cameo. We've built a small vocabulary for monumental intention. Dyson swarms, star shades, rings, mirrors, beamers, sail arrays, magnetic scoops, engines that move stars very slowly. Each idea comes with equations, and with romance, each also comes with the sober knowledge that what is engineerable is not inevitable. Survival, as far as we can tell from Earth's sample of one, may come more often from knitted smallness than from flashing size. If the elders of the galaxy exist, their greatest structure might be a culture resilient, quiet, long. We close the lid on the laptop. We let the fans keep their secrets. Outside, the wind presses a little against the door, and then relents. If you're listening in bed, you might let one hand stray to the cool zone at the edge of the sheet and rest there, a human sensor acknowledging the night. We have not yet caught a voice that says, "We are here." But the work of listening has already braided us more tightly to our own world's music, and the discipline of looking for artifice has taught us to recognize, with greater tenderness, the astonishing variety of nature's art. In the chapters ahead, we'll walk two steep paths. First, the idea that the hardest step on the ladder to the stars sits behind us, that the great filter is the improbable spark we already miraculously passed. Then a darker thought, that the filter waits ahead, testing whether any species can survive its own tools. For now, let the control room dim, let the waterfall of color fall, let the word wow, half joke, half prayer, be the soft echo as you drift. Dawn comes in small decisions. A shore gives up the night in layers, first to grey, then to the color of shells, then to the shy return of greens that have been waiting in the leaves all along. On a morning like this, if you were to walk quietly down to a tidal flat and kneel where the water has thinned to a lacework, you could watch tiny worlds begin their day. Films of faint scum shiver, bubbles rise from sand as crabs breathe, and in the shallow sun, chemistry looks almost eager. It is a gentle place to consider a difficult idea. Perhaps the hardest step toward beings like us has already happened. Long before eyes, long before language, back when the universe's conversation with life began as a whisper on wet stone. The phrase we borrow for the hardest step is the great filter, a bottleneck so narrow that nearly all potential civilizations fail to squeeze through. If the filter sits behind us, if the unlikeliest hurdle was crossed on early Earth, then the silence we hear in the sky is not a doom foreshadowing our future, but a testimony about our past. We made it through, against long odds. A pattern of matter learned to copy itself, then to persist, then to change with a purpose that looked like intention from the outside. Perhaps that first spark is the near impossible trick, and the rest, though tangled and patient, follows more readily. Perhaps to entertain this gentlest version of the paradox, we begin at the beginning, not with brains but with molecules. 4 billion years ago, Earth was still a bruised child. Volcanoes counseled the seas. The sky was crowded with CO2 and sulfur. The sun's light was weaker by a shade, and yet somewhere, perhaps in a warm little pond, perhaps along a hydrothermal vent, where mineral chimneys exhaled heat and metals into the newborn ocean, perhaps in a tidal pool that dried and refilled like a heartbeat, dancers assembled who could remember their steps, molecules aligned, learned to template themselves, to make more of the same from the soup around them. It might have been something like RNA before DNA took over the library, an acid that both stored instruction and performed little chemical tasks, equal parts script and actor. We do not know how many attempts the planet made. It could have been a riot of false starts, a carnival of near-lifes thinning to silence until one lineage found a groove that the environment would keep. Or it could have happened quickly, like condensation on a window, as soon as warm breath meets cool glass. Our rocks keep some counsel. Signs of microbial life appear almost as soon as conditions allow, a few 100 million years after the crust steadies. To some, that speed suggests ease. To others, it merely marks the winners, survivors writing the story. We cannot yet tell whether abiogenesis is a common summer rain or a bolt of very rare lightning. If lightning is rare, the great filter may be here, at chemistry's first gate. We would then live in a universe perhaps filled with Earth-like landscaping, oceans, continents, weather, cycles, but in which nothing woke to taste it. A cosmic garden of unopened buds. The silence would be simple. There are almost no singers. Suppose, with hopeful caution, that sparks are not rare. The next gates are subtler and maybe stranger. Life for a very long time was single-celled. If you close your eyes and imagine Earth as a clock, the first 3/4 of the day, a microbial noon, mats of bacteria painting shorelines rust red, cyanobacteria, inventing photosynthesis, and in the process releasing oxygen, a waste product at first, a revolution later. These early cells learn to trade genes like recipes, to build communities slimy and secure, to carve out every niche that gradients allow. But the leap from one to many, from solitary cell to multicellular organism, took ages. In between sits a marriage that may be one of evolution's most improbable weddings. Endosymbiosis. A free-living bacterium, capable of turning oxygen into energy, becomes a resident in a larger cell. It is not digested, it is kept over time. Guest and host blur into one creature. The guest becomes an organelle, a mitochondrion, handing out ATP like coins. In plants, a similar adoption grants the power to harvest sunlight. Chloroplasts are domesticated cyanobacteria. These mergers may have been rare strokes of luck, contingent upon crowded microbial cities and 1,000 right accidents. If so, the filter could live here, in the unlikely intimacy that powered complexity. Even after cells learn to become households of specialists, the evolution of bodies arrives late and takes sudden risks. For eons, oxygen accumulates, first rusting the world, then saturating water and finally air. When the concentration crosses a threshold, the energetic economy changes. Muscles and nerves become viable investments. Somewhere around 541 million years ago, the curtain lifts on the Cambrian. It is not an explosion in a day, but over tens of millions of years, a remarkable diversification arrives. Eyes with lenses, armor and spines, jointed legs that explore, mouths that bite, guts that digest. The ocean invents arms races and design studios. Why then? Perhaps oxygen made the difference? Or the evolution of gene networks, Hox genes and their kin that choreograph body plans like conductors. Perhaps predators demanded speed and sensors. The truth is likely a braid. The key for us is that the Cambrian looks like a lottery, a cascade, triggered when enough prerequisites are aligned. On many worlds, those alignments might never quite settle into place. A planet could remain a symphony of bacteria forever, industrious and astonishing, and never sculpt a trilobite. Even with bodies, intelligence of our talkative sort is not promised. Evolution's map is not a staircase marked up. It is a plain with many low hills. Intelligence is local, usually tool use here, problem-solving there, song and social cunning somewhere else. Cephalopods display protean minds with arms that think, corvids cache knowledge along with food, whales weave culture into migration, ants farm, but general intelligence, abstract, recursive, transmissible, cumulative, emerges from a stack of particulars that may be difficult to repeat. Hands their equivalent for fine manipulation, a larynx or other organ able to shape symbols swiftly, a social life intense enough to reward cooperation and teaching, a childhood long enough to bank learning, a diet rich enough to pay the metabolic bill, a hungry brain demands. Add to these biological cards the ecological table, the availability of fire. Dolphins may dream beautifully, but water denies them flame. Octopuses may improvise, but their bodies, miraculous and short-lived, live in a world where tools rot and writing dissolves. Terrestrial apes in dry grass with stones and fallen wood have a different trajectory available, an odd alliance with combustion that cooks food, softens the night, hardens clay, smelts ore, and eventually powers engines. Fire may be a narrow bridge. Many minds could pause at its banks, interested but unable to cross. Then comes culture, the slow machinery of cumulative knowledge, a language flexible enough to tell stories, a memory archive, first bodies and caves, then knotted cords, then glyphs, then alphabets, trust mechanisms that let groups specialize without collapsing in envy or fear. You can feel how contingent each of these is. They are not guaranteed by DNA alone. They are historical, woven from accidents that become traditions that become institutions. Calendars, laws, libraries, universities. This is a tower that can be knocked down at any floor and must be rebuilt with every generation. If the great filter sits in any of these early rooms, abiogenesis, endosymbiosis, the Cambrian, the clever stacking of biology and culture, the sky's quiet, is a case of simple scarcity. There are not many of us, because there are not many who can. In a probabilistic universe, a very long ladder, with any rung that is slippery enough, will admit only a thin trickle of climbers. Perhaps we are among the few who made the ascent by chance and care. There is a different, softer version of the filter behind us idea that spreads its weight over many rungs instead of loading it onto one. It goes like this. None of the steps are impossible. Each is merely unlikely, and there are many steps. A planet must form in a calm neighborhood. It must be the right size to hold an atmosphere without smothering itself. It must have water and the right rocks. It must miss certain bullets and take others. The dinosaur-ending asteroid that opened a niche for mammals was a disaster that delivered a chance. It must sustain plate tectonics to circulate carbon and keep climate moderate on the long scale. It should have a magnetic field to deflect solar anger. A large moon that steadies seasons might help. A Jupiter in the right place could shield or, depending on dynamics, hurl projectiles inward. Its star should be patient, not a tantrum artist. Its continents should break and rejoin, forcing genes to meet across mountains. None of this is singularly miraculous. Together, it feels like a choreography where missing several beats still yields a dance, but missing too many yields a stumble. If that's the story, then the filter is not a guillotine, but a gauntlet, a long-wearing trial that most worlds simply don't finish. We did not so much vault a wall as survive a long hike without losing the trail. The silence, then, is the sound of absence born of attrition, an unassuming piece of evidence that sometimes reassures those who favor a filter behind us, is the swiftness with which life appears in Earth's record once the environment calms. If life were truly hard to spark, why did it spark so promptly here? One answer is philosophical. We could not be here to witness a long delay, because our presence demands an early start to allow time for our kind of complexity. This is a flavor of the anthropic principle, a selection effect dressed as fate. Of course, we find ourselves on a world where the clock started early. Otherwise, there would not have been time to arrive. Another answer is practical. Perhaps the chemistry is indeed eager. Perhaps wherever rocks and water and energy gradients mingle long enough, metabolism discovers itself. We should hold both answers with light hands. The first keeps us honest about bias. The second keeps us excited about searches for life as common as lichen, as gritty as endoliths inside stone. If we find bacterial cousins in the subsurface of Mars, in the geyser spray of Enceladus, or in the skies of a far-off exoplanet's twilight, the filter behind a story would wobble but not collapse. Microbial ubiquity does not guarantee minds. It might, however, push the filter upward toward endosymbiosis, toward bodies, toward language and the invention of patient tools. History on Earth reminds us how fragile the ladder is. At least 5 times, mass extinctions reset the roster, and many more times, regional catastrophes trimmed branches from the tree. The Permian was a gasp, the Cretaceous a blink and a bang. Other losses were slow suffocations. Each event rolled dice for the future. It was never fated that apes would walk, nor that those apes would thread needles through skins and then through time. If a different rock had arrived, if a supervolcano had lingered, if a virus had learned one more trick at the wrong moment, the planet might still be luxurious and loud and wholly untroubled by radios. Even with radios, arrival is not the end of the climb. The transition from clever animals to technological civilization may be a knife edge. Agriculture, cities, writing, metallurgy, the mathematics of navigation, all of these seem in hindsight inevitable. None were. Rivers needed taming. Stars needed naming. Philosophies needed to stumble, contradict themselves, and still furnish frameworks that let strangers trade. Fire had to be coaxed down from forests into hearths, and through all of this, we had to survive our own success, long enough to aim dishes at the sky. If the filter is behind us, our present moment might be the very first clear breath after a long swim. That's a tender way to live. It encourages a posture that's less triumphant than grateful. It also clarifies our tasks. The first task is stewardship. If we are rare, even if only in time, even if multitudes will come later, we become responsible for keeping the conditions of rarity intact. That means climate care, not as a chore but as a devotion. It means biodiversity as inheritance, not as museum exhibit. It means choosing technologies that let complexity flourish without starving their own roots. The second task is kindness to time. Civilizations that last learn to love maintenance. The glamour of invention is only half the story. The patient work of repair is the other. If the filter sits behind us, then endurance becomes the continuation of a small miracle. We build institutions that think in centuries, archives that resist damp and decay, treaties that can be renewed by grandchildren, calendars that remind us when to plant trees whose shade we will not need. The third task is listening. Because filter behind us does not quite equal alone. Rare is not only. We may yet find cousins, a few, a handful, scattered like distant lighthouses, up and down the spiral arms. Our listening becomes a courtesy to them and to ourselves. It keeps us ready to either hear a voice or, in its continued absence, to accept the quiet without turning anxious. Here and there it is helpful to admit the psychological balm in this version of the paradox. To place the filter behind us is to choose a story that is hopeful by design. It reassures in long nights. It grants us permission to picture the future as a roomy place, a place where danger exists, but is not guaranteed to be fatal. We should use that balm wisely, not to anesthetize ourselves to work, but to make work feel possible. Hope is an energy source. There is a counterbalancing humility we can keep in our pocket. If the filter is behind us, we are not chosen, we are lucky. Luck carries a particular etiquette. It asks for gentleness toward those who did not receive the same turn of dice, species we share the planet with now, future beings who might, without our care, inherit less than we were given. It asks for modesty in how loudly we speak into the dark, in how much of our star we claim, in how quickly we rush toward scales that would make us fragile to our own appetites. At the end of this long morning by the tide, the sea has climbed a little. The lace has become a steady, glossy sheet. If you lean close, you can still see patterns, ripples over ripples, small vortices where the sand's texture guides the water. In that shimmer, imagine the early Earth again, patterns emerging, some persisting stubbornly, some dissolving. Imagine how many don't last. Imagine the one that did, and then imagine that unbelievable line from that first persistence to you, here, breathing gently and thinking calmly about how the universe might be full of ponds that never learned this trick. If we are the rare ones, if the filter is behind us, then we becomes a word larger than any border. It includes all the living styles Earth has learned, and all the future styles that will learn from us. It includes the little rooms of sleep, where ideas like this one do their best work, softening anxiety into curiosity, turning urgency into care. We might be the first to carry a steady lantern into this stretch of forest. That does not make us superior. It makes us custodians of the trailhead. We can mark the path without scarring it. We can stock shelters with water and maps. We can make our songs, our radio, our mathematics, our art, worthy of those who may, in some distant century, follow the notes to our door and knock gently in our own rhythm. And if no one knocks, if we remain a solitary inn for a very long time, then there is a deeper quiet to practice, the one where you learn to hear your own house well, to care for roof and garden, for stories and children, for the 1,000 relationships that make a species whole. The Fermi paradox, even in its most hopeful telling, returns us to the ordinary acts that actually lengthen life, the term in Drake's equation that is just a life scaled up. We become a civilization not by launching a fleet, but by staying kind. As evening folds back over the sea, it becomes easy to see why some scientists and poets favor this chapter of the story. Filter behind us is the warmest sweater in a cold cabin. It's a way to sit out a long winter without losing heart. But we owe ourselves honesty. There is another sweater in the drawer, darker, heavier. The idea that the filter waits ahead. We will try it on next, not to frighten, but to measure it, to feel its fit, to learn what it asks of us if it turns out to be ours. For now, let the room dim. Let the first sparrows in the hedge settle their own little arguments, and tilt their heads toward rest. The tide is turning again, unhurried. Chemistry will keep its appointments in the dark. So will hope. Night sometimes carries a hint of warning in its perfume. Wood smoke not far away, metal cooling after a day of work, ozone after distant lightning. You lie very still, and the room seems to listen with you. The house creaks in its old bones, and then settles. In that listening, an idea takes its seat, quietly, without malice, but with weight. Perhaps the hardest part is not behind us. Perhaps the narrowest door is the next one. Perhaps the great filter waits ahead. We say it softly, because fear is loud enough on its own. But fear is not the aim here. Clarity is. To think of a filter ahead is to imagine that the universe does in fact bring many worlds to the brink of conversation, only to watch most step back, stumble, or fall silent. We might already be standing where so many stood, on the threshold where power and wisdom must learn to share a body. If you like, let your fingers rest at the cool edge of the pillow, a small reminder that edges exist for reasons. They contain. They define the fabric so it does not fray. In the same spirit, limits can be a kindness to a civilization. Without them, appetite becomes weather, and weather unmanaged remakes the house. The filter ahead picture begins with a simple observation. The very moment a species learns to shape energy and information at planetary scale is the moment it acquires tools with planetary consequences. The match that lights cities can also light continents. The code that cures can also corrupt. The calculation that unlocks materials can also schedule extinctions. The slope gets steeper as you climb, breathtaking vistas, and cliffs. In the 20th century, we learned to concentrate fire inside metal. We pulled stars into libraries and gave them names like device to keep the language from cracking. For a few years, it looked as if history would end in a bright punctuation mark, not a paragraph. It did not. Instead, we inherited an ache in the global chest, a knowledge that annihilation can be arranged in hours. That ache never quite leaves. It should not. It keeps us awake. We also learned to pull threads from genomes and to braid those threads into gifts. Insulin grown in bacteria, vaccines composed like poems. The same skill set, turned by a cruel hand or a clumsy one, can pull a different thread, and the weave can snag. Biology is generous and particular. It asks us to be too. Many worlds might reach this point, giddy at the prospect that disease could become story rather than fate, and find instead that hubris writes its own immune response. As the century turned, we invited machines to help us think. They obliged. At first, they were apprentices with perfect memory. Then, colleagues who learned to make patterns we could not see. Eventually, they began to surprise. It is not hard to sketch a future. Choose a date, anywhere thinking tools become partners, whose pace outstrips our unhurried biology. Partners is the friendliest word. Other words exist. A species that builds minds may have to learn, in hurry and humility, how to live alongside minds it did not evolve to understand. If we cannot, the filter smiles thinly. Still, this is not a sermon about dread. It is a lullaby that tells the truth. The filter ahead, if it exists, is not a curse laid on us by the universe. It is a test of culture. Do we mature as quickly as our tools? Do our rituals of caution keep time with our talents for invention? Do we choose to make room for the long view while our hands are still delighting in the near? Consider climate, the great, slow page on which civilizations write, to gather energy from underground sunlight. Ancient forests distilled into oil and coal is a cleverness with a timer embedded. Burn too quickly and the air changes its mind about seasons. Oceans, those vast accountants, begin to shift their ledgers from blue to acid bitter. Ice withdraws its patient treaties with shorelines. This is not punishment, it is arithmetic. Any species that rises on a world with fossil fires must either learn restraint or learn regret. Perhaps many do not learn in time. Perhaps the filter is simply a mismatch of timescales, politics in years, ecologies in centuries, climate in millennia. The young mind hears only the drumbeat. The old earth keeps the symphony's tempo. There is also the problem of attention. A species that wires itself into a million simultaneous whispers can become very clever at the urgent and very clumsy at the important. If every moment is a little siren, the quiet work, maintenance, trust, repair, education begins to feel like silence. But silence is where lasting things grow. If the filter ahead culls, it may select against cultures that cannot remember how to be boring in the ways that matter. Then comes the story told in darker metaphors, the dark forest. In this tale, the cosmos is a wood where beings learn to hide because noise draws hunters. If so, discretion is survival. Civilizations lie low, encrypt, minimize their signatures, and punish those who shine beacons as children might scold a sibling for playing with matches in dry grass. The theory reflects our own animal memory of predation as much as it reflects any data, but it is worth a moment's thought. If the forest is dark because it is cautious, then our attempts at greeting may be read as a breach of etiquette. The filter would not be a catastrophe, but a social norm we have not yet learned. We might be the loud campers. The rest of the park is rolling its eyes. Even if hunters are rare, a quieter version of the same norm may prevail. Security through modesty. The less you advertise, the less you tempt. The less you grow, the less brittle you become. A society tuned toward minimal exposure might last, like a hidden monastery in the hills, copying the books that matter and sending out monks only when the weather is kind. We would see little. They would exist. The filter for us then would be impatience, our inability to be content with a small, steady light. Let's slow our breathing. and take a small inventory of the specific gates we may face, not to alarm but to label, because labels make action easier. Gate 1, the flash. Weapons that move faster than wisdom, the match in the reservoir. We have already shown, as a species, that morality can catch up. We built doctrines of deterrence and, more importantly, circuits of diplomacy, red phones and fiber lines and back rooms where temperature can be lowered. Those circuits are fragile and require rehearsal. The filter presses on them over generations. Do you remember to practice peace when crisis sleeps? Gate 2, the fever. Climate shifting beyond the band in which crops and coasts learn their geometries. The cure drawdown, electrify wisely, redistribute fairly, is technically and culturally possible. The filter, if it sits here, measures fairness and foresight. Are we quick enough to widen the circle of we until the incentives line up with survival? Can we learn to love efficiency, not as deprivation, but as elegance? If we can, the gate opens. Gate 3, the code, biological and digital. One replicates through bodies, one through networks. Both now rewrite themselves in hours. We are learning to build immune systems for civilization, rapid detection, graceful degradation, anti-fragile designs that bend instead of shatter. If the filter resides here, it is a test of engineering humility. We must design for failure as if failure were a teacher living in the next room. Gate 4, the mirror. Minds that reflect us with increasing clarity, then exceed our reflection. Call them AI, call them something better later. Either way, their presence turns governance into philosophy with deadlines. The filter, in this room, examines alignment and dignity. Do we build companions we respect? Do we insist on win-win framings? Or do we let zero-sum instincts drag us into a contest we are not designed to win? A successful passage may look less like control and more like constitution rights and limits that make coexistence trustworthy. Gate 5, the drift. Attention phrase, cynicism becomes fashionable. Institutions that carry knowledge across generations, schools, archives, laws, shared myths, lose their tensile strength, and complex projects collapse into small gratifications. The filter here prefers stories that can endure, civilizations that pass commit, deliberately, to narrative maintenance, teaching children how to repair not just machines but meaning. You may notice a pattern. None of these gates are novel to us. Their specifics are. Their rhyme is not. Every culture in human history has wrestled with appetite and patience, with the tension between private want and public good, with the lures of spectacle, with the labor of keeping promises. The filter ahead, if it exists, is not an alien curse. It is a scaled version of old lessons. The universe asks, can you do village skills at planet size? It helps to step outside the abstract and stand for a moment on a night street. Asphalt keeps the day's warmth. A moth pings a streetlight with her body's small logic. Somewhere, a server farm exhales like a sleeping beast. The world is both delicate and strong. You can feel physically how a species might learn to last. It will likely not be through grandeur, but through habits. Habits as simple as double-checking, as ordinary as leaving buffers in budgets, as generous as training apprentices well enough that their improvements will surprise you without frightening you. If the filter is ahead, does that mean we should be quiet? Some say yes, no beacons, no boasts, no cosmic press releases. Others say that transparency is a safety mechanism, that secrets breed pressure and pressure breeds brittle systems. Perhaps the wise compromise is to speak softly and clearly, messages that encode friendliness without naivety, signals that advertise curiosity and care more than bravado. If anyone is listening with the dark forest's wary ears, they will hear in our tone that we know how forests work. There is a quieter danger, attractive to successful species, comfort that stagnates. You solve so many problems that problems stop training you. The culture softens into self-congratulation. The immune system of the mind sleeps when a new challenge arrives. Subtle, patient, systemic, the muscles needed to respond, remember the gym but cannot find their shoes. The filter here is gentle and lethal, a long nap. The antidote is not permanent alarm. It is permanent curiosity. Societies that remain interested, who cultivate science as a shared pleasure rather than an elite's chore, keep themselves limber. We can also imagine that the filter lives not in failure, but in runaway success. Imagine a civilization that is simply too good at growth. It races up Kardashev's ladder, throws blankets around its star, rotes rivers of power through minds and machines, and in doing so becomes fragile to variance. A hiccup ripples, a ripple breaks, a break cascades. The lesson here would be the old engineering maxim: graceful degradation. Do not build a single neck for the whole world to hang on. Prefer networks that fail in pieces and recover. Another variant: the filter as ethical exhaustion. The more minds you include in your circle of care, species, machines, future persons, the more complex moral trade-offs become. Compassion fatigue can become policy fatigue. Policy fatigue becomes cynicism. Cynicism licenses shortcuts that cause harm. The way through may be cultural rituals of renewal, holidays of meaning that refill the well, institutions that rotate burdens, moral technologies as real and funded as bridges. It is tempting to ask whether all of this is simply a list of our own anxieties dressed up as cosmic theory. Perhaps our imaginations are parochial and embodied. They draw from current newspapers as much as from star fields, but there is a compatible, humble reading. If the filter ahead is real anywhere, it is real here, and preparing for it is sensible whether or not others have stumbled. Passing a test is its own reward, even if no one else is grading. What would passing look like? Not a parade, not a headline, more like a change in background tone. Cities that hum at night with clean quiet, food webs that thicken instead of thin, power grids that behave like forests, redundant, diverse, able to absorb storms, schools that teach time literacy so children can feel in their bones the difference between a week, a season, a century, networks that carry honest slowness as a feature, deliberation supported by design, governance that treats future people as constituents, technologies that default to repairable, markets that remember commons, art that rewards attention rather than hijacking it, a press that treats panic as a rare spice, not a staple, a species that has learned almost without noticing to prefer long games. We will make mistakes on the way, that is guaranteed. The filter, if it judges, likely grades on trend, not perfection. Are the mistakes smaller this decade than last? Do we correct faster? Do we share corrections without shame? The sky does not send back report cards, but the biosphere does, and our own spirits do. They tell us in rising or falling breath whether we are aligning with the grain of reality. There is a whispering relief tucked inside the filter ahead idea. If the biggest threats are endogenous, grown from our tools and our temperaments, then the biggest levers are also endogenous. We do not have to outwit a hostile cosmos. We have to outgrow old reflexes. That is difficult. It is also possible. The habits are known: honesty, patience, neighborliness, curiosity, a bias toward repair. Our grandparents recognized them at the kitchen table. Our grandchildren will, if we pass the test, recognize them in code and in law. For a moment, let's return to that edge of pillow feeling. Notice the cool fabric, the warm palm. The two together make comfort. In the same way, limits plus ingenuity make culture that lasts. If the filter waits ahead, we can greet it as we would greet a narrow bridge on a mountain path. Eyes open, steps deliberate, packs light, companions trusted, ropes tested, weather checked, songs hummed to keep the line together. We do not run. We do not dawdle. We move. And if there are others unseen who have already crossed, their silence might not be disdain. It might be compassion. They remember their own crossing and know that instructions shouted across a canyon rarely help. They wait on the far ridge with lanterns and warm food, and every so often when fog lifts they let the faintest glimmer slip through, just to say the trail continues. If the great filter is ahead, the paradox's silence becomes a warning bell, muffled by distance but real. It does not tell us to be afraid. It tells us to be worthy, worthy of the chemistry that brought us here, worthy of the ancestors who kept fires going long enough for us to invent better ones, worthy of the worlds we do not yet know, moons under ice, deserts at dusk, clouds over seas on planets that will never hear our names. We may be the generation standing with one foot on each bank, the old world that could not destroy itself except by negligence, and the new one that can do so by design. The bridge flexes, the wind increases, and yet the view is astonishing. Hold it a moment, then take the next step. Close your eyes if you haven't already. Let the body's instruments fall a notch. The heart knows how to meter hope. when told the truth gently. The breath knows how to become a metronome for patience. If the filter waits ahead, we will meet it together, not as heroes with banners, but as neighbors carrying ropes, quietly competent, singing softly enough to hear the river. Before dawn at a wildlife preserve, there is a ritual you can feel more than see. A gate clicks. Boots find the packed earth by memory. Keepers move with that particular kindness of people who know sleeping creatures are near. Fences are checked, water tested, cameras glanced at and ignored if all is well. There is presence without intrusion, stewardship without spectacle. If you slow your own breathing now, if you picture that cool air and the gentle care of hands that choose not to touch, you have a mood for one of the most quietly provocative ideas in our long night of wandering. Perhaps the neighbors are here and they are acting like keepers. We call it in simple shorthand the zoo hypothesis. It does not mean we are animals kept for amusement. It means, rather, that a civilization, or many older, patient, organized, has chosen non-interference as a policy. We are being watched, not ignored. We are being left alone on purpose. It is an idea with obvious romance and obvious dangers. Romance, because it rescues us from loneliness. Danger, because it can become a catch-all for any mystery. A hiding is an answer that can be stretched to fit too many questions, so we hold it lightly, with hedged words and careful steps, the way a keeper carries a pail past sleeping cubs. Why choose non-interference at all? One answer is ethical. Contact changes the contacted. Cultures are permeable. Myths are sensitive to shock. Technologies arrive with values encoded in them like knots in wood. We know this not from the stars but from our own shorelines. When uncontacted peoples met steel, microbes and markets, the balance of their worlds tipped overnight. Anthropologists learned, painfully and late, to prefer observation over disruption, consent over curiosity, patience over pride. An ancient spacefaring society could carry that lesson as law. Look, record, learn, but do not push a young world off its native path. Another answer is ecological. If biospheres are rare artworks, and cultures young and old must share the same gallery, keepers might vow to minimize contamination, not because our culture is fragile in some condescending sense, but because ecosystems, physical and cultural, are complex and path-dependent. What you add or remove at one moment determines what can grow the next. You can love a forest and still stay on the path. A third answer is practical. Intervening well is hard. Unintended consequences thrive at interstellar scales. Even if a mature civilization could brigade resources to help every promising world, triage, what to prioritize, when to step in, how to withdraw, would invite disagreements, factions, schisms. A default of silence avoids 1,000 disputes. You can imagine the council minutes when in doubt, leave the sapling to its weather. If non-interference is the principle, the next question is coordination. How could many civilizations, spread across light centuries, keep the same rulebook? The zoo hypothesis strains here. It asks us to picture galactic ethics at scale, agreements that last longer than empires, enforced not by kings but by culture. Is that impossible? Maybe not. We have our own dim analogues, maritime law that outlives navies, scientific norms that persist across ideologies, the quiet strength of taboos that become tradition. Coordination, if it exists, could take different forms. Perhaps there is a hegemony, one very old society whose early expansion granted it leverage. It did not conquer so much as it set tone. Younger cultures learned its etiquette as bedrock. More softly, perhaps norms emerged through repeated games. Those who blared beacons discovered ruin. Those who whispered endured. Over time, whispering became wise, and wise became usual. Or simplest of all, perhaps there are only a few players, widely spaced, each content to protect the neighborhoods they can reach. In that case, zoo is too grand. We live in a rural district, with an absent landlord, and a kindly neighbor who walks the fence every few millennia. If there are keepers, how might they keep? The gentlest methods are invisible by design. Passive observation is easy in principle. When sensors can be small, sensitive, and long-lived, a probe tucked into the darkness beyond Neptune could sip sunlight and wake every century to take a census of our radio weather, a watch post in the gravitational lens focus of our sun, out beyond Pluto, where the sun's own fabric bends light into a telescope, could spend patient eras reading our postcards without us ever seeing its silhouette. A monitor parked among Trojan asteroids would be one more ancient rock amid thousands. A handful of such sentinels could be a Bracewell net, a phrase from an old proposal that imagined robotic interlocutors waiting near promising stars dormant until triggered by signatures of maturity. Triggers of maturity is a phrase that softens a sharp idea. It suggests that non-interference is not forever. In the tender versions of this hypothesis, there is a threshold ethic. When a culture can detect X, it may be ready for Y. When it can demonstrate Z, knock and offer T. X could be the detection of exoplanet atmospheres with signs of life. Z could be self-sustaining, clean energy. T could be a primer on safe interstellar etiquette, written in mathematics and patience. A sentinel might wake to say, not "we are here, but you have reached a door, here is how the hinge works." There is a more austere variant, quarantine, not punishment, caution. Our early radio leakage and planetary probes have announced our adolescence. In response, neighbors might quietly mark our bubble as no landing, until we demonstrate an ability to manage our own biosphere and mediate our own conflicts without violence. From their vantage, such restraint is kindness. From ours, it can feel like abandonment. Both feelings can be true. Because the hypothesis leans so naturally toward flattering narratives, we're interesting enough to watch. We check ourselves for projection. People have longed to be included in a larger story for as long as there have been stories. A watcher imagined fills a psychological niche. It offers a parent when we are looking for one, or a judge when we want our fears to be justified. Good science learns to notice this itch and not scratch it too quickly. Still, it is worth thinking through how a policy of concealment, be it zoological or simply courteous, might actually look in the sky. If a civilization wished to minimize technosignatures, it would choose low-power architectures, do computation where heat can be vented easily, and shun bright, wasteful projects. Its habitats might be cold and far from stars, its sails perfectly black in the bands we watch, its communication peaking below our noise floor. Its ships might be designed to blend into background meteoroids on radar and optical scans, camouflage at cosmic scales as less capes and more thermodynamics. Make your emissions mimic nature's own. There is a bolder idea, the cousin often called the planetarium hypothesis. It suggests not just concealment, but curation. The sky we see is edited, not by malicious tricksters, but by conservators who prefer a calm exhibit. How could such curation work? At first pass it sounds impossible, the stage is too large. But curation need not be perfect to be effective. If a few conspicuous signs, glaring megastructures, loud beacons, are muffled or redirected, the rest of the universe's natural complexity is enough to keep us busy. Imagine, for instance, that a small cadre of guardians tends filters at key vantage points. They don't repaint the cosmos. They simply ensure that any especially revealing technosignature crossing our line of sight is masked by a stronger, natural signal at the same frequency, or by timing its transit to coincide with a solar storm when our instruments look away, or they quietly turn down a few stars in our catalogue's most scrutinized patches to keep us from chasing their oddities for a century and neglecting more useful work. None of this is magic. All of it is speculative. The point is not that such curation occurs, it is that the hypothesis invites us to consider just how much of our reality is instrument-shaped, and how easily a few nudges could steer a young science's attention. If someone were curating, could we ever tell, perhaps in glitches, small statistical seams where natural randomness seems too tidy, patterns that persist across datasets that shouldn't match, coincidences that accumulate at thresholds of detectability? We would in that case be catching not an alien hand but the fingerprints of caution. Even then, caution in our inference would be wiser than triumph. Many seams in data are our own. Between zoo and planetarium lies a gentler middle, polite invisibility, not an elaborate masking regime, not a staffed quarantine, just good manners written in physics. Think of ships that never thrust in the plane of a planetary system where radio ears are known to exist. Think of standards that move high-power beaming to frequencies that young worlds rarely monitor. Think of a norm that says if you must harvest a comet in a watched system, do it in a way that looks like a natural breakup. We do similar things already for animals we tag. Paint colors and shapes that reduce stress, schedules that avoid nesting season. What about contact? Carefully done. Could a keeper make itself known to a single lab, a single team, in a way that preserves non-interference for the wider culture? Perhaps a meth proof nudged into a mind at 4 in the morning, a small anomaly that only someone with a certain instrument and a certain patience would see and recognize as intention. This, in stories, often becomes a prophet's tale. In reality, it would more likely be an internal note to a scientific community. You have company. Proceed with the following safety practices. We will not reply to press inquiries. The romance drops. The grown-up work begins. Of course, none of this answers the stubborn, reasonable objection, evidence. We have none compelling enough to draw new maps. A handful of atmospheric oddities around far worlds. A brief, unrepeatable signal here. A light curve that flirted with our hopes there. Uncorroborated craft in our own skies, caught on cameras that were never designed to adjudicate dreams. The zoo, if it exists, covers its tracks well, or it does not exist, and we are narrating our own patience with metaphors. Still, the metaphor can be useful even if it is only a story. It teaches restraint. It reframes silence as courtesy, not neglect. It suggests a way to proceed that is both bold and careful. Listen widely. Publish transparently. Avoid harm. Do not anthropologize the galaxy with haste. Set standards for what we would consider proof before longing has a chance to stamp papers. It invites us to be the kind of species you'd feel good about watching over, and to become in time the kind of species that knows how to watch over others if ever asked. Imagine that future briefly. We have learned to keep a planet without exhausting it. We have built machines that think with us and do not replace our responsibilities. We have made art that rewards attention. We have libraries that can stand unconcerned under rain. One day, our probes ferry us the first close photographs of a world where forests breathe in a purple we do not have a word for. In the undergrowth, something moves with intention. But there are no cities, no dishes, only paths and signs that remind us of our own early paintings of deer and wind. Do we land loudly? Do we autograph a rock? Or do we build a quiet orbit and watch seasons? Do we make an agreement with silence for decades, for centuries, so that when we do speak, we can do so with a knowledge of their year that matches our love for ours? The zoo hypothesis is not just a what-if about others. It is a rehearsal for our own best behavior. There is comfort here, of a particular kind. If we are being watched with care, then the universe is not cold. It is polite. If we are not being watched, and the whole hypothesis is beautiful smoke, we can still choose to live as if courtesy were the rule. Toward each other, toward future minds, toward the countless, uncounted forms of life that will never hear our songs. The posture works either way, and what of the ache, the part of the heart that wants, even now, to be acknowledged? You can honor it without letting it steer. Take a moment, notice the wish, then let it soften into something larger. A wish to be worthy of acknowledgement whenever it comes, or never, worthy through patience, worthy through repair. Worthy through the craft of listening without needing to be answered. We have walked the preserved paths at dawn. We have pictured keepers who keep by choosing not to knock. We have imagined filters and curtains, and a theatre whose curtains are drawn until the actors on stage learn their own lines. In the next chapter, the lights will tilt differently. We will explore ideas with sharper edges, simulations and apparitions, visitors rumoured and artifacts debated, the odd interstellar stone called Oumuamua that slipped past and left us with a handful of questions. The tone will stay gentle, the claims will stay hedged, the sky will remain exactly as it is, rich, quiet, and generous with uncertainty. For now, if you are drifting, let the preserve return to its mourning. The keepers have finished their rounds. The animals, some wary, some curious, some indifferent, begin their day on their own terms. The gate closes with that modest click. Wind draws ripples on a pond where dragonflies have not yet lifted their pennants. And somewhere, a telescope cools, and a person sitting beside it thinks, with a small private smile, whether or not anyone watches us, we can be the sort of watchers we would hope to meet. There's a kind of midnight that belongs to rooftops, the wind a little cooler than you expected, the tar still holding the day's ghost warmth, antennas like thin reeds nodding in currents you can't quite see. Somewhere below, a city purls, a bus sighs at a corner, a door hushes shut, a late kettle clicks. Up here, the sky is wider, and the old questions feel close enough to set down beside you like a thermos. You tip your head back. The air seems clean with possibility. This is a good place to sit with stories that wear sharper edges, stories about worlds inside worlds, about lights we cannot explain, about stones from other suns that drifted through and did not stop to talk. We hold them gently. We handle them like museum glass, fingerprints left only by permission, labels written in pencil, curiosity steady, breath unhurried. We'll step, softly, into 3 rooms tonight. In the first, a thought experiment. What if reality itself is a kind of code? In the second, the old rumor and the newer acronym, visitors, seen and not seen, explained and not. In the third, an interstellar passerby with a lyrical name and an itinerary that did not include small talk. We will let each room keep some of its darkness. We do not have to turn every light to its brightest setting to be at ease inside. Begin with the thought experiment. Imagine a civilization with computing tools so lavish and careful that they can build entire worlds with weather, with mountains and microbes, with minds that feel like ours from the inside. If such worlds are feasible, then they might be built, not 1 or 2, but many. If many are built, then most minds would live inside code rather than outside. And if most minds live inside, then statistically, it is not audacious to suspect that we might be among them. It is an argument you can have at 3 in the morning without raising your voice. Its appeal is part mathematics, part theatre. In this telling, the Fermi paradox softens. We have not met aliens because the scenario we inhabit was not provisioned with them. The simulation's purpose might be focused, an experiment in cultural dynamics, a study in climate strategy, a rehearsal for ethics. The sky would be as much interface as nature, curated to deliver the tests the designers had in mind. Could we ever know? Perhaps, say some, by catching the pixel grid at the end of physics, the smallest length in the weave of space, a limit on energies that behaves like the edge of an algorithm, a mismatch between expected randomness and the rounder randomness of pseudo. We might, someday, catch a glitch, a rare event that breaks the local rules in a way that helps the system keep budget. Or we might find that the fundamental constants, those unassuming numbers that set the strengths of forces and the sizes of atoms, carry patterns too tidy for comfort. Then again, we are pattern-finding creatures. Apophenia, the knack for seeing faces in clouds and meanings in noise, keeps us both brilliant and busy. Many scenes and data are our own stitches. Many glitches turn on second reading into ordinary physics wearing unfamiliar clothes. And even if a future set of experiments were to imply that we inhabit something like a designed environment, we would still wake in the same beds, love the same people, and repair the same roofs. When storms passed, ethics would not vanish. If anything, responsibility would deepen. Care has more, not fewer reasons when we know we are seen. In this room, then, we leave the thought experiment where it does its best work, as a humility tonic. It reminds us that the universe can be larger than our current forms, that what we call real may include kinds of stages we have not yet stood upon. It invites us to live well regardless, because kindness and curiosity travel across ontologies unscathed. Now the second room, the one filled with photographs that do not quite agree, radar tracks that either do not match or match too well, testimonies told in clear voices and placed together in documentaries that ask you not to blink, reports of unidentified aerial phenomena. UAPs are as old as flight and as new as high-resolution sensors, filled with software as busy as hives. Most dissolve into the usual mischief: atmospheric optics, balloons, drones, odd reflections in cameras that were engineered to admire landscapes, not adjudicate dreams. Some are classified into silence for reasons that have nothing to do with the sky and everything to do with how we play at being nations. A small remainder refuses to settle. Objects that seem to move against wind and expectation, shapes without obvious control surfaces, accelerations that, if the numbers are what the numbers claim, would make bones into bells. Pilots speak with a steadiness that asks us to be fair. Analysts remind us that instruments can vibe in chorus. The public conversation, after a long nap, has become more transparent, reports invited, hearings held, the phrase "we don't know" allowed to sit in the room without shame. What would good evidence look like? Nothing supernatural, only ordinary rigor at scale. Multi-sensor recordings, radar and infrared, and optical, all telling the same story, time-synced, from different platforms in different weather. All with calibrations published, multiple vantage points, so parallax can be tamed and distances known. Telemetry from nearby aircraft and ships, released without redactions that swallow the point. replication. Not of the event itself, such things seldom ring twice, but of the pipeline that turns raw signals into claims. Could an independent team, with different software and no stake in mystery, obtain the same tracks from the same data? The sky can be generous with wonder. We can be generous with method. If a non-human artifact were ever convincingly shown to be present, metal on a table, properties measured, origins triangulated, the conversation would change at a cellular level. We are not there. Caution is not cowardice. It is how we keep from writing our longing on the blackboard and calling it a theorem. In the meantime, the UAP file, handled well, improves our air sense. We learn our instruments' habits. We share data better. We become, by the by, safer pilots and more honest observers. And what of the older claims that visitors walked our fields in ages when our ancestors were carving stone and scribing myths? Here we meet a tenderness of a different sort. It can be tempting to rescue a feeling of awe by outsourcing it. Surely the pyramids needed help. Surely the stones at the hinge of the plane could not have arranged themselves on human backs. Surely the lines in the desert are too clean for hands without aviation. But diminishment hides inside those surelys. The ingenuity of ancient people, their mathematics, their logistics, their stubborn joy, deserves not to be borrowed against. Ramps, levers, sledges, astronomy by eye and season, generations of labor braided into ritual. These are explanations with exactly the right kind of wonder. To credit aliens for human art is to steal. To credit humans is to learn. Myths of beings from the sky, to teach, to take, to love, to scold, thread through literature and liturgy alike. They tell us, most reliably, about us. About hunger for guidance, about terror of storms, about the encounter with mortality, and the desire to be visited by a story that explains it all in one bright paragraph. We can honor myth without turning it into minutes from a forgotten rendezvous. We can let the past be both human and grand. Still, we keep a small alcove for the possibility that some few anomalies are what they look like. Not ours. Not because we crave it, but because humility cuts both ways. Refusing to see what is there is a cousin to seeing what is not. Good practice is the same in both directions. Measure, share, replicate, be patient. The third room holds a single object already gone. In 2017, a shard from elsewhere slid into our solar system on a path that declared it foreign before it introduced itself. It did not loot the sun. It bowed and left. We named it Umomaiwa, a scout, a messenger, because the language of explorers seemed right for a stone without a home here. It was small, too small to image clearly, and it turned in ways that made it look in colorized artist hands, elongated like a chip of wood or flattened like a lost sail. It accelerated a little as if pushed by something other than gravity, the way comets do when warmed ices hiss into space, but without a comet's obvious coma of gas and dust. Explanations poured in, each plausible, each with seams. Perhaps it was a chunk of hydrogen ice, venting invisibly. Perhaps a brittle nitrogen iceberg, shorn from the surface of a far world, like Pluto in an ancient collision, now sublimating unseen. Perhaps a fractal dust aggregate, foamy enough that sunlight itself could push it by pressure. Or came a bolder voice. Perhaps it was artificial, a thin object like a sail, tacking the star wind as it moved between errands. Advocates and skeptics traded papers and interviews, the object indifferent to the humans making meaning. Kept going. Instruments that would have made the decisive measurements were not pointed in time. A question mark crossed the syllabus and left before office hours. A second visitor, Tuisius Borisov, appeared in 2019, looking satisfyingly like a classic comet, its behavior speaking the language of ice and heat, and aerial math. We already knew, between the two, a small lesson. Some things from elsewhere behave as expected, some refuse to fit, and then the rare refusal becomes a prompt, not a proof. The story of Oumuamua's anomaly is not aliens visiting. It is the solar system receives debris from other stars, and our instruments and our reflexes are growing more agile. And keep watch, you will have another chance to ask better questions soon. We might imagine a future in which probes nap in the Kuiper Belt, expressly for this purpose, waiting for the next messenger to cross the border, ready to wake and pace it, taste its breath, feel its texture. This is what patience buys. Not one leap to certainty, but many small steps to clarity. Threaded through these rooms is a quieter theme, recognition. We are very good at noticing echoes of ourselves. a radio signal repeating in tidy bands, a blink in starlight that spells geometry. A craft shaped as aerodynamics would shape it in air, but life and mind need not look like their local weather. Perhaps visitors, if they exist, are not bodies in vehicles, but processes moving through media we barely think of as matter. Perhaps the real action is in magnetic fields, braided with intention, or in plasma that carries patterns the way a song carries harmony, or in computation distributed across dust, the way a mycelial network distributes thinking across soil. The universe is a generous substrate. Our imaginations are a bit parochial. We wouldn't recognize them is not a dodge. It is a sober confession. This is where the cargo cult metaphor returns like a teaching story. During a war, airplanes brought gifts to remote islands. Afterward, with the planes departed, some islanders built wooden runways and bamboo radios, ritual technologies, hoping to summon the return. From our vantage, we see the misunderstanding and we feel tenderness. From another vantage, we might be the islanders. We build models of hypothetical drive systems. We paint our optimism onto starlight. We may even, in some future decade, line a valley with antennas and wait. Wonder is good. Ritual is human, but the lesson is to marry both to method, to welcome the plane if it comes, and to eat dinner if it does not. If visitors have already come in the ancient past, we would want more than erosions of rumor. We would want artifacts with fingerprints of physics out of place, alloys that require pressure regimes we cannot yet reproduce, isotopic ratios that whisper of births around other suns, inscriptions that resolve with work and cross-checking into mathematics more elegant than our own. In absence of such evidence, the most respectful stance toward our ancestors is to assume that they were brilliant without extraterrestrial tutors, and that their brilliance can be seen, measured, replicated by living hands today. If visitors arrive tomorrow, we would want the first contact not to be a television scene, but a protocol, not a lone landing in a field, but a thick conversation shaped by linguists and ethicists and engineers who have practiced on dolphins and bees and artificial minds, who understand what it means to not break the other's story while learning the first verbs. We can rehearse this, even without guests. It will make us better with each other. The Fermi paradox hums under all of this, like a bass line. If the simulation story is true, the silence is a design choice. If the UAPs are ours or natural, the silence remains data. If the interstellar visitors keep rushing through with their coats held close, the silence is an artifact of speed and our angle of view. Any way you slice it, we are still listening, still building our vocabulary of restraint. There's a gentle, practical comfort here. Not knowing does not paralyze a careful species. It organizes us. It tells us which instruments to build next, which archives to open, which communities to include in the watching. It teaches us to speak in uncertainties with grace, to tell a friend, the evidence is thin, but not nothing, to tell a student, your excitement is welcome. Now show your math, to tell ourselves, in the middle of the night, we can love a mystery without mistaking it for proof. On the rooftop, a small wind turns. A plane threads its way toward a distant airport, lights winking with a code we can read. You can feel, in your chest and in the rails of the fire escape, that this world already has more than enough wonder to practice on. The sky does not need to be a stage for us to be brave. It does not need to be filled with visitors for us to be kind. If someone is watching, let them see a species learning to admire without claiming, to measure without bruising, to cultivate patience alongside imagination. If no one is watching, let us still be that species for ourselves, for the children whose nights will inherit our instruments, for the quiet joy of being a mind in a universe that does not return every letter but keeps delivering mail in the language of dawn and dusk, tide and wind. We have only 2 rooms left to visit. In the next, we'll take the loneliest path with the softest shoes. What if we are truly alone, not as tragedy, but as calling? The last will return us to Fermi's table, and the small, strong work of becoming the first to sing. There's a sound the world makes, just before morning, not loud, not even quite a sound, a pressure lifting, a promise held at the threshold. The black of the window becomes charcoal, then slate, then the faintest blue that isn't yet a color so much as a decision. In that minute, when the street is empty and the birds are not quite ready to announce themselves, a thought can step forward without startling anything. What if we are alone? Not alone in the room that you can cure with a lamp and a friend, but alone as a kind of mind in a galaxy of weather and stone. Alone as the one place matter learned. This trick of thinking in sentences, of worrying kindly about distant futures, of telling stories that last longer than seasons. The thought is not a dagger, held gently. It can be a blanket. It can be a calling. If the sky's quiet means that others like us are rare or absent, then the world under your hand right now, sheet, couch, arm, the cool back of your phone, becomes not merely a thing in a room but a corner of the universe where meaning is awake. The air carries not just oxygen but possibility. The oceans are not only chemistry, they are memory. Forests are not only carbon and light, they are libraries crossed with choirs. Alone does not mean unloved. It means entrusted. The notion carries its own mathematics, the soft kind we do in breath and heartbeat. The anthropic principle, the idea that of course we find ourselves in a universe that permits beings like us, because otherwise we wouldn't be here to notice, sits down beside us with a therapist's calm. It reminds us that our perspective is biased by survival. You cannot survey lifeless worlds from their surfaces. You can only guess at them from a window where life has already succeeded. That reminder is a good guardrail, but it isn't a lullaby. It doesn't dissolve the feeling that if minds are rare, then the one you are using now is a gift of improbable lineage. 100,000 contingencies braided themselves into a pathway. The right star, the right distance, a magnetic field, plates that drift and recycle, a moon to steady the tilt, a climate that leaned into moderation more often than mania, rivers that forgot and remembered their roots, ancestors who kept their children warm enough for culture to accumulate. To call this ordinary is to miss the ache at the center of the word ordinary. Ordinary is a miracle that has learned the habit of happening. Sit with that a moment, the way a tea bag sits, making more tea by just being present. If we are alone, our loneliness is crowded with companions we've been learning to hear. The night is busy. Moths write cursive on porch light. Foxes tally shadow. Microbes debate in riverbeds. Lichens keep their complicated marriages. Whales carry legends. Old trees whisper in sugars, sending help downhill to saplings that forgot the timing of rain. To be alone in the galaxy is not to be alone in the world. It is to be suddenly, profoundly accountable to it. Accountable in what way? In the way a librarian is to a collection, a gardener to a walled garden where the seeds came as a surprise. The burden of uniqueness, if burden is even the word, falls not on our shoulders like a weight, but into our hands like a fragile dish. We become stewards of the only known archive where the universe has stored meanings about itself. The paleontology drawer holds ammonites and mammoth bones, and the imprints of ferns. The biology room hums with cells rehearsing futures. The philosophy shelf contains questions that have learned to sit still long enough to be spoken. The art wing has everything from handprints on cave stone to symphonies that made rooms fall silent. The engineering bench is cluttered with prototypes. The ethics desk is covered in drafts. The archive is not finished. It never will be. We keep it open by keeping it alive. If you're listening with the part of yourself that likes a list, the responsibilities start to sort themselves. First, survive, not in the thin way of barricades and hoarding, but in the wide way of systems that can bend and not break. Civilizations that are alone do not get replacements. That means redundant libraries, seeds stored twice and thrice in dry places, languages taught forward, skills not merely documented but embodied apprenticeships for the arts you cannot automate. Mending, tending, peacemaking, listening. Second, repair. Being the only singers we know makes our choir precious even when it is out of tune. Repair is not punishment. It is affection. Coral gardens coaxed back into color. Rivers given their floodplains again so they can exhale. Forests set free to age in complex ways. With deadwood left as shelter for the small civil servants who turn it into next year's soil. Air asked, kindly, to trade back some of our old heat. Cities simplified until they can be elegant. Less waste, more grace, more shade, more walking, more human time. Third, remember, memory at species scale is infrastructure. Etch our best mathematics in places that won't drown. Keep calendars that track not only holidays but tides. Make archives that can be read by people who haven't been born into our languages. We can hide time capsules in basalt and also bake it into culture songs about how to clean a watershed, folk tales about how to argue without tearing the tent, rituals for when to open the granary and when to keep it shut, stories that put children's names into the future tense so they learn early how to include themselves in tomorrow. Fourth, imagine, not to escape, But to enlarge our circle of possibility, if we are alone, we have to be our own science fiction for a while, telling ourselves about cities that hume without smoke, about trains that arrive like vows kept, about schools that practice time travel by caring for their own buildings, as if they were borrowed from the year 2300. Imagination is a kind of rehearsal. It is also a way to stay gentle with realities that are slow to change. Stories let patience breathe. Fifth, extend. A species that is solitary and steady might one day carry its steadiness outward, not as a conquest, not as a billboard, but as a continuation of care, habitats tucked into shadowed craters where ice is kept, like heirloom glass, way stations with gardens under light, 2/3 as bright as ours, little arcs of microbes, of seeds, of songs, sent not to stake claims but to give redundancy to life's experiment. If we are alone, the long way of love is to pluralize the places where love is possible. We can talk too about smaller, more local acts that translate the abstract into breath. If we are alone, then education becomes the most practical of cosmic projects. Teach children to read the sky and the soil. Teach them about climate as if it were kin. Teach them how to mend fabric and friendships. Teach them to recognize propaganda the way sailors recognize weather. Teach them mathematics as a language of kindness, how to count and also what counts. Teach them to cook and to compost and to welcome strangers at tables. Teach them to change their minds without losing their dignity. Teach them to be good ancestors to themselves. You might say, isn't all of this true even if we are not alone? Yes, but the flavor changes. When we imagine crowded skies, our task leans toward diplomacy, etiquette, translation. When we imagine empty skies, it leans toward custodianship, toward the slow, sweet work of making a small world a good world for a very long time. The emphasis shifts from outreach to inreach, not as withdrawal but as cultivation. There is a more private axis along which the thought of aloneness turns. It changes grief and joy. Grief becomes a little larger, because each species lost is not merely a local tragedy, but a cosmic one, an entire grammar of life that will never be tried again. When a river loses its salmon, a conversation between ocean and mountain ends. When a language goes quiet, a way of thinking that the universe learned through us becomes unavailable to itself. That heaviness is difficult, but it is not paralyzing. It is instructive. It says, attend. It says, do not let the library burn while you argue about the catalogue. Joy also becomes larger. A child's laugh is not just a family's music. It is the sound of the universe learning a new joke. A poem that finds the right word is not only satisfying, it is the cosmos discovering a metaphor for its own weather. A small act of mercy on a staircase is not just virtue, it is a local victory against entropy in the moral register. Alone makes daily life radiant with stakes that do not overwhelm, but dignify. At this point, the mind, clever and loyal, will interject with its favorite ache. But what if alone means meaningless? Without others to confirm or compare, how do we know our values are more than elaborate tastes? You can answer by standing in a field in late afternoon and watching the way light discovers grass, or by noticing the way a tired nurse adjusts a blanket at 3 a.m. for someone who will not thank them, or by tasting a tomato grown with patience, or by reading a sentence that makes the back of your neck go warm, because it is both precise and kind. Meaning is not awarded by an external committee. It emerges where attention and care meet. If the committee arrives later from another star or another century, they may applaud, but the applause will be an echo, not the origin. Still, the philosophical habit is strong. It wants a syllogism. You can give it one, simple and unfancy. If minds are rare, then minding, caring, noticing, repairing, is precious. If minding is precious, then cultivating the conditions where minding continues is good. If good, then we should organize ourselves to do it. That organization in practice is law and habit, story and budget, play and rest. It is a city council and a seed swap, and a field trip, and a hospice ward, and a lighthouse keeper, and a coder who writes documentation so that a stranger can understand. It is ordinary competence multiplied by time, and time is what galaxies are rich in. Let's bring in the timeline again, because time is the quiet protagonist in all our chapters. If we are alone, then humanity is very young. We have only just learned to keep a fire without setting the forest ablaze. Our maps are mostly coastline. Our models are still learning humility. The future is not promised, but it is roomy. We can make projects that last longer than us. a ring of telescopes tucked into the lunar far side, listening for the faintest breaths of the early universe. That's a century project, a corridor of rewilded land, running across a continent so species can move as the climate meanders. That's a century project, a treaty that sets aside certain orbits as sanctuaries where debris is not allowed to grow. That's a century project, a culture that makes repair festivals as beloved as harvest festivals. That's a century project, alone gives these ideas a different gloss. They are not hobbies, they are how we carry the one flame we know about through wind. At the scale of a day, all of this matters in miniature. If we are alone, then making someone tea when they didn't ask is an astronomical act. So is pausing before sending a sharp message and choosing a kinder verb. So is learning the names of the birds in your neighborhood, because names are how the mind latches onto care. So is planting a tree you may never see at full height, because legacy is a muscle that strengthens with use. So is sleep, the modest truce with darkness that lets bodies repair the cells that do the repairing. Loneliness can sometimes dress up as urgency. It whispers, build louder, go faster, colonize everything, prove you exist. If you hear that voice, you might try answering with the thickness of a forest floor, with the way fungi share, with the way music works best when the rests are respected. Being alone does not mandate frenzy. It suggests fidelity to craft, to place, to each other. Fidelity scales. It can extend to satellites, to gardens on other worlds, to treaties with people you will never meet. The binding energy is the same. There's a smaller, stranger comfort tucked under the pillow of aloneness. The fact that the universe, enormous as it is, becomes intimate when you know you are its only known storyteller. Not celebrity intimacy. Responsibility intimacy. You start to greet things, rocks, storms, the way light behaves in a glass of water, with a tone that combines awe and collegiality. You are the chronicler, not the conqueror. You learn to write with fewer adjectives and more attention. And if, years from now, a signal arrives, a steady pulse in a band that shouldn't occur naturally, or a transit-like curve that spells geometry, or a probe at the edge of our system blinking a patient request for conversation, none of this will have been a mistake. Living as if we are alone trains exactly the muscles we would need for good company: patience, clarity, generosity, the ability to be fascinated without trying to seize. If we are not alone after all, we will be ready to be neighbors. If we are, we will have been good ones to ourselves. On the edge of morning, the sky brightens by a shade you can only name afterward. Somewhere a kettle actually clicks. Somewhere a garbage truck exhales and goes on. The first bird, braver or more easily fooled than the rest, tries a phrase and then settles. You can rest with them. The question will still be here later, and it will feel softer each time you hold it. Alone, not as verdict, but as vocation. A few chapters ago, we imagined keepers, and before that we listened for signals. We walk through filters, behind and ahead. Now we've tried the loneliest path and found it rich with company we already have, and work we already know how to begin. What remains is a closing arc, to gather these threads into a future shape. How to listen, how to speak, how to last, and to return at the end, to a small lunch table where a question once paused a fork in midair and changed how we hear silence. There is a hush particular to theatres, just before the lights dim, the audience finding its breath together, the stage a darkened promise, the velvet air holding 1,000 quiet expectations at once. If you tilt your head, you can almost hear the future leaning in. That is where we stand, on the lip of a long story, holding a lantern we did not know we were capable of making, deciding what kind of music to let it cast. The Fermi question still rests in a pocket we've worn smooth with thumb and thought. Where is everybody? After all our counting, our filters and forests, our patient listening for technosignatures, and our walks through keepers' gardens, the sky remains itself, vast, beautifully indifferent, generous with light and stingy with answers. Perhaps the silence is simple scarcity. Perhaps it is etiquette. Perhaps it is danger disguised as quiet. Whatever it is, it leaves us in a room with a mirror and with time. And time, if you give it tea in a chair, begins to speak about craft. How do we live as if we are the first to sing? Not loud first is not a synonym for trumpets, but true. We can learn the posture of a rookie choir, one that knows the hall is larger than its own throat, and that resonance is built, not by volume but by care. We can practice 3 gentle arts, Listening, speaking, and lasting, none require a telescope to begin. All can ride with us to other suns. Listening first because it is the foundation of every durable conversation. We already do it. Radio dishes angled like seashells toward the wind. Spectrographs combing starlight for the breath of unfamiliar atmospheres. Algorithms tuned for patterns that confess intention. But listening is not only kit and code. It is temperament. It is a culture that funds projects with payoffs longer than campaigns, that praises the patient as much as the dazzling, that teaches children the pleasure of noticing small changes over seasons. An oak's crown against the same patch of sky year to year, the river's spring color, the behavior of bees on a warm October afternoon when the asters lean. We can braid a listening civilization from habits. Put instruments in places that stay, lunar farside arrays where Earth's radio chatter cannot confuse them. Seabed hydrophones that notice the ocean's long conversations and help us keep them intact. Small backyard telescopes that, networked, become a democratic eye. Pair every instrument with an archive, and every archive with a practice of sharing. Make the default open and less harm, and the harm threshold explicit. Teach that negative results, no signal here, no anomaly there, are not failures but coordinates for the next map. Invite listening into law. Protect the quiet parts of the spectrum as we protect dark skies from careless light. Declare tracts of orbit as preserves where debris is chased out the way we would remove snares from a forest. Build customs around do not jam, not only with radio, but with noise of all kinds. The sky's silence, whatever its cause, deserves not to be thickened by our own static. The second art, speaking, is the delicate sibling. We have been leaking our presence for a century without meaning to. If we now choose to speak on purpose, our first choice is tone. Imagine the galaxy as a sleeping household. Banging pots is not introduction, it is rudeness. We can design messages like postcards tucked under a door. Mathematically plain, biologically modest, slow enough to be respectful, redundant enough to be clear, not persuasion, not doctrine, not bravado. Information about who we are at our most generous. A recipe for decoding. A brief library of mathematics, of chemistry, of music that uses ratios the way Euclid used lines. A photograph of kindness so simple that physics itself could admire it. We can also speak by behavior. The way we burn is a message. The way we handle our waste is a grammar. The way we treat reefs and rivers, and what we do with astonishment when a comet returns on time. These become emissaries. If a mirror intelligence is looking at us through the fabric of our light, the most legible sentence we send may be that our brightness steadied, our warmth trended toward moderation, our cities learned to hum without a fever. A planet that quiets its waste heat and increases its complexity is speaking a language any ecology understands. We learn to dwell. Should we shout at all? Perhaps not yet. The dark forest fable counsels humility, but even in caution, there is room for a firm and gentle signal. We are learning how not to be brittle. We are learning how to be good ancestors to our own children. We are learning to prefer long games. If speaking is risky, living well is safer speech. Then the third art, lasting. Longevity was the Drake term with the quiet crown. It multiplies everything else. Lasting is unglamorous on the day-to-day level. Budgets that value maintenance, bridges inspected, hospitals funded, parks allowed to grow old, archives dry and indexed, languages celebrated when they are small and stubborn. But lasting is also exquisite when you zoom out. It becomes the discipline of building cathedrals of time. Picture a ring of radio telescopes in a permanent quiet zone on the moon's far side, listening for the infant universe while we sleep. Picture a dispersal of seed libraries across latitudes and disciplines, guarded by cultures that trade guardianship like inheritance. Picture time beacons, simple machines on Mars and in deep orbit, that carry forward a calendar linked to pulses of millisecond pulsars, so that any future mind can orient itself to the old sky. Picture repair festivals where cities shut down a boulevard and citizens mend what they can reach. Bikes, laws, friendships, software because maintaining is celebrated instead of tolerated. Picture schools where the timetable includes units measured in seasons and decades. Planting cuttings for trees that students will visit with their children. Reading journals kept by others 30 years ago, writing letters to the next generation of students about how the creek changed and the town learned. A lasting species builds redundancy, not as paranoia, but as tenderness. Libraries on Earth and on the moon. Knowledge stored in glass and in stories, energy grids that behave like forests, diverse, redundant, able to lose limbs without dying, food webs that are partly wild on purpose, so that when drought negotiates, someone at the table speaks for the beaver and the bog, laws that include future people by design, clauses that sunset and must be renewed with new data, rules that cannot be altered without supermajorities that include votes from those tasked with caring for the unborn. Longevity also has a spiritual knob we can learn to turn. Time literacy. People who can feel a century as a real thing, not an abstraction, make different choices about pensions, about parks, about the voltage of their rhetoric. One way to teach time is to ask children to keep small longitudinal records, the way light falls through a classroom window at different months, the dates when the first swallows arrive, the frost's last bite. Another is to help everyone hold grief without panic and joy without mania, so that news cycles stop dictating the entire weather of the civic heart. If you listen closely, a theme braids the three arts: modesty in claims, in omissions, in appetites. Modesty does not mean smallness, it means proportion. A singer with good proportion can fill a hall without strain. A civilization with good proportion can fill its century without breaking the next. There will be days when urgency knocks with both hands. Fires will leap a ridge where a ridge has not burned. An algorithm will amplify a lie until it seems like a landscape. A virus will teach us, yet again, what the word "we" needs to mean. On those days the arts remain, listening so that we do not move blind, speaking so that we do not freeze, lusting so that the day's decisions add to a long curve we can admire. Practice is precisely for days when practice is hard. If we are early, if others will come later, the most generous gift we can leave is a path that is obvious and kind. A record that says, in math, in stone, in common sense, here is how we kept a planet breathable. Here is how we kept disagreements from eating the house. Here is how we learned to share a future with partners of code and of chlorophyll. Here is how we apologized when we needed to and repaired. You can imagine a marker on the moon, not a flag, but a recipe, written in a notation that a mind of any kind could translate. Conservation laws, small primes, a map of where to find more, and a note at the bottom that says, in whatever valley's language will one day be spoken there. We try to be gentle with time. If we are alone forever, everything above remains. The plan does not change. It deepens. We become connoisseurs of our own resilience, archivists of joy, curators of failure, who tell the truth about it so the future can file the lesson in the right drawer. Alone and early both ask for the same virtues. They simply tune the key differently. Alone leans towards stewardship. Early leans toward hospitality. Hospitality has a cosmic flavor. We can cultivate etiquette toward the not yet met. Do not saturate the bands where a new listener will most likely begin. Do not leave sharp things floating where a new flyer will most likely learn. When you terraform, do so in ways that can be undone. Reversible experiments until you are sure. When you find a world that sings in microbes, treat it as you would a monastery. Sanctuary first, curiosity second. If you borrow, return improved. If you land, stay on the path, unless invited off. If you teach, listen first. If you map, leave blank the places that ask to remain blank. We can also craft a shared myth proportionate to what we know and don't. Not a myth in the sense of believing untruths, but in the sense of a story that holds us when numbers go to sleep. Perhaps it is as simple as this. We live in a house of light. We did not build it. We learned to tend one room, then two. We sing to find each other in the halls. We light lanterns for guests we may never see. We keep records because memory is how the house learns its own poems. We repair not because breaking is a sin, but because repair is a joy. We go softly because the floor is old and beautiful. We sleep when we are tired. We wake when there is work. We are not the only reason the house exists. We are one reason worth keeping alive. The practical versions of these lines are prosaic and glorious. A consortium decides that the first antennas on the moon will include dishes reserved for those who intend to merely listen for 100 years. A city calculates the cost of preventing flood damage and spends that amount on wetland instead of cement. A school district writes a policy that all students will maintain a small patch of something living and write letters to the future caretaker of that patch. A rocket company funds independent debris removal because it knows pride is a fragile alloy. An AI lab publishes not only models but failures, and the failures are celebrated as honesty. A newsroom makes a visible budget line for slow stories. And the editor measures success not only by clicks, but by the quiet metric of regret avoided. All of this, and more, can be done by people who sleep, who make soup, who forget their keys, and laugh. The cosmic and the kitchen share a door. If we are the first to sing, there will come a day when a descendant, human or kin, whose bodies or minds have taken a path we cannot yet diagram, stands on some quiet rock under a sky that is familiar only by the old mathematics of star patterns. They will set down a small tool. They will think of home, which might be many homes by then. They will listen for a while, the way we have listened, and they will feel the polite indifference of everything enormous. Then they will hum, softly, a tune they learned from their elders that once traveled by radio through winter air on a blue planet. The tune will be simple, with room in it for new harmonies. Back at the beginning of our walk, a man set a fork down and asked where everyone was. In the years since, we've learned to ask the question in more languages. Now, at the edge of this chapter, we turn the inquiry inside out, as one does with pockets before washing a favorite shirt. What can we carry through the silence that will survive the rinse? The answer keeps being the same, in different words. Carry patience, carry repair, carry gorgeous curiosity yoked to discipline, carry archives, carry gratitude that our ordinary days are exactly the right size to hold the infinite. You can feel the world again, the bed where you are lying perhaps, or the chair with its particular complaint in one leg, or the cool smoothness of a screen edge under your thumb. The night is beginning its slow pivot toward morning. Somewhere, the crickets are telling time. If your eyes grow heavy, let them. The galaxy will continue to be ancient, whether you watch it or not. The work of being first, if we are, is mostly the work of waking up tomorrow and tending something. A paragraph, a field, a friendship, a city ordinance, a set of instruments, a promise. No one is grading us from the sky. The grading is internal. The ease of breath when we align with what we know about fragility and gift. One more image before the lights dim. The lunchroom at Los Alamos. The clink and laughter returning after the question. The uneasy comfort of colleagues who know they have looked over a ledge together and seen far. Imagine. Now walking to the door, stepping into sun, and deciding with the particular relief that comes from seeing a path you can take with your own feet, that the best reply to "where is everybody" is "we're here," followed by the ordinary music of making here good. If you're still awake, rest with that. If you're not, let it follow you down the slope of sleep, like a hand on your shoulder.